Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax to, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Story 1: The Ghost Town. The group of 7 friends had been planning this trip for months. It was the vacation they had long dreamed of. A brief escape from work, stress, and the monotony of daily life. They chose a small town in rural America, a place seldom visited, surrounded only by untouched nature and fresh air. The town, called Ashford, seemed like the perfect destination for a peaceful getaway. What they didn't know was that this trip would turn into a never-ending nightmare. The story began on a misty morning when their car finally left the main highway and began winding through narrow, twisting roads. The sky was overcast, with only faint streaks of sunlight piercing through the clouds, casting a gloomy atmosphere. They reached the outskirts of Ashford by late afternoon, but strangely, there was no sign of life. Old, dilapidated houses lined the roadside, their windows fogged and yards overgrown with wild grass. "I think we took the wrong road," said Kate, one of them, staring at the map on her phone. But the screen showed no data, no signal. The unease began to settle in. "Let's keep going. Maybe there's an inn or something up ahead," said Jason, Kate's friend, with a soft smile, trying to ease the tension. But as they entered deeper into the town, things grew even stranger. The narrow road into the center had no signs or directions. A few houses had dim lights on, yet there seemed to be no one inside. Even stranger, the cars parked along the streets looked ancient, like they hadn't been used in decades. Though the town seemed abandoned, the eerie silence hanging in the air made it impossible to simply turn around. They decided to stop at a small roadside cafe, the only place that appeared to be open. Inside, the air was thick, heavy, as if time itself had stopped. The cafe was empty, save for them and an elderly waiter standing behind the bar. His eyes cold, as if he had known them for years. "Welcome. Sit wherever you like," the old man rasped, his voice coarse but with a strange familiarity. The group sat near a window. They ordered black coffees and chatted lightly, but none could shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, they felt cold eyes gazing at them from afar. But when they turned, they saw nothing unusual, just ordinary people passing by. It wasn't until nightfall that things began to unravel. As they prepared to leave, they discovered their car wouldn't start. The tires were deflated, even though they had just arrived. They tried calling for a mechanic, but no one answered. A quiet panic began to creep in. They decided to look for a nearby hotel or motel. A frail old man stood by the cafe's entrance, his eyes dark and haunting. "Don't go," he whispered. "You won't be able to leave." Before anyone could respond, Mark, one of the group, broke into a sudden panic. "What is this? Are we trapped here?" he asked, voice trembling. Everyone tried to stay calm, but when they stepped outside, the town had changed. The roads, the houses, everything looked different. Then they began to see townspeople emerging from every corner. But the strangest part was, they all looked just like the friends in the group. Only their eyes were hollow and empty. They didn't speak. They just stood silently, staring. with unsettling smiles. At that moment, the group felt it deeply. Something was terribly wrong. This town was like a pale copy of the real world, a place where time and space had lost all meaning. They tried to find a way out, but the more they walked, the more it felt like they were trapped in an endless loop. The roads kept circling back, with no escape in sight. Each night, strange dreams began to haunt them. Memories they never lived started to surface in their sleep. Each person experiencing different visions, but all sharing one thing in common. They saw themselves in bizarre, twisted scenarios, as if some force was puppeteering their lives. On the third night, they all awoke from nightmares, only to realize they couldn't remember what had happened during the day. Items in their hotel room had been moved, and the paintings on the walls weren't the same ones they had seen before. Somewhere in the distance, a soft laugh echoed, familiar, like the laughter of their own friends, yet cold and haunting. "We have to find a way out," Kate said, her voice shaking but firm, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. This town, whether real or a dream, had them in its invisible grip. And each night, their memories were reshaped, as if they were living inside a cycle they could never break. Would they ever escape Ashford? Or would they be trapped forever in this strange nightmare? The answer remained a mystery, an unsolvable question, as each step brought them closer to the horrifying truth buried within the walls of this town. Ashford was never meant to be a vacation. It was a place where they would fight against forgotten memories, until they could no longer recognize themselves. The next morning, as the faint sunlight pierced through the thick dark clouds, the group of friends still hadn't found a way out of the town. 3 days had passed since they first set foot in Ashford, and everything had grown increasingly strange. By now, there was no more doubt. They were trapped. The winding roads, the empty houses, and the eerie townspeople showed no signs of leaving. It was as if the entire town was passively watching their despair, without a shred of concern or responsibility. The group decided to start the day by searching for some sort of clue. Maybe a barn, an old house, anything that might offer a way out. However, as soon as they stepped out of the hotel, a bizarre feeling washed over them. The town looked the same, but something felt off. Everything was too quiet, so quiet that it stifled any sense of relief. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the still air, as if even sound was being choked by the deathly silence. Kate was the first to notice something odd. As she neared a seemingly abandoned house, she spotted a figure in the window. It was the silhouette of a woman, standing still, gazing outward with hollow eyes. A chill ran down Kate's spine. She quickly turned away, but then something even stranger happened. She couldn't quite recall what she had seen, as if the memory of that figure was being erased the moment she looked away. And yet, the feeling that something was deeply wrong lingered. "Did you guys see anything?" Kate asked, her voice trembling. Everyone turned to look where she pointed, but there was nothing. Just an ordinary house with dark windows. No trace of a woman. The group fell silent, confused. "Maybe you're just tired, Kate," Mark said, patting her shoulder, trying to comfort her. But Kate's eyes were filled with fear. "No, it wasn't that. I saw her clearly." Still, they couldn't stop. The town was too vast, and no one would answer their questions. They kept walking, drifting through the empty streets. By now, the friends were beginning to doubt their own existence. Maybe what they were seeing were merely copies, imitations of their friends, replaced by something else. The feeling of living in a replica of the real world clung to them, inescapable. An hour later, when the group wandered into a more secluded area, they suddenly found a strange sign, a red painted line stretching along the ground from an abandoned house to a backyard garden. It looked like a path laid out for them to follow, one they couldn't refuse. An indescribable feeling rose within them, but curiosity pulled them forward. They followed the line, passing through a small patch of woods and arriving at an old house. This house looked unlike any other in Ashford. Tall, shrouded in haze, with deep cracks lining its walls as if abandoned for decades. Yet it pulsed with an uncanny sense of life. Just then, a cold gust of wind blew past them, carrying with it a faint whisper, like someone softly calling their names. Jason was the first to step inside. The old wooden door creaked open with an unsettling groan. Inside, the house was engulfed in darkness. The tattered curtains seemed ready to crumble, and the paintings on the walls had yellowed with age. A damp, moldy smell filled the air, choking their lungs. As they entered, it felt as though they had stepped into another realm, a place no one could explain. The fabric-covered chairs were rotted, but arranged neatly, as if someone still sat in them every day. Stranger still, every item in the house was arranged according to some eerie pattern, like part of a twisted game someone had laid out in advance. As the group moved deeper into the house, an unexpected sound echoed from behind them. They turned, but saw nothing, just their own shadows reflected in the mirror. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps came from the floor above. The group froze. No one dared to climb the stairs. They knew something was waiting up there. Not curiosity, but a deep, primal fear. Still, they couldn't turn back. They had no choice but to press on, no matter how frightened they were. They decided to go upstairs, but what they saw there shocked them. On a large table lay a map, spread out, marked with the same strange red lines they had followed earlier. But what terrified them most were the photographs laid across the table, photos of them, each one of them, but not happy memories. These were snapshots of them in strange situations, ones they couldn't remember. They saw themselves in horrifying scenes, as if they had already lived through them. A chilling, haunting feeling filled the room. It was as if they were looking at themselves in a parallel world, a world they never wanted to be a part of. A question emerged in their minds. Were they just copies? Or were they trapped in a nightmare they could never wake from? At that moment, the answer no longer mattered. As they began to understand the truth, they also realized it was already too late to escape Ashford. That night, none of the friends could sleep. The feeling of being trapped in the strange town still haunted them, like a ghost refusing to let go. They sat in the hotel room in silence, each trying to make sense of the bizarre events they had experienced. But none of them could put into words the cold, creeping fear that blanketed them. Another strange thing had happened the previous evening, after they left the bizarre house. When they returned to their room, they noticed that the items inside had been moved, as if someone had rummaged through their belongings. The suitcases, clothes, even the mirror on the wall. Everything had been shifted. A heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched filled the space. Jason was the first to notice something unusual. He realized that the photos on the hotel walls, landscapes of the town, were no longer the same. The new photos were blurry and now showed strange figures that resembled them, standing in different positions. But their eyes in the photos were cold and lifeless, as if the people in them weren't truly them. It was like looking at replicas, eerie illusions. The group no longer had the courage to go outside. They couldn't understand why these memories defied explanation. Was there some mysterious link in Ashford they had yet to uncover? Was this some twisted test of fate? Or had they fallen into an endless loop with no escape? The next morning, when they decided to leave the hotel and find a way out of town, something strange happened again. They couldn't find an exit. The roads before them blurred, as if the town had no way out. Every path led them back to where they had started, like they were running in circles, an endless maze. The feeling of being trapped grew heavier with each step. "What do we do now?" Kate asked, her voice trembling with fear and a hint of despair. "Maybe we should find someone to ask, to learn more about this town." Mark, though frightened, tried to remain composed. "We just need to find a local. They'll know how to get out." So the group decided to search for townspeople. As they walked along the eerily empty streets, they began to notice something chilling. Everyone in town looked the same. Each person wore the same odd expression, with blank stares and strange, unnatural smiles, as if they had lived through countless days without ever aging. Even stranger, no matter where the group went, they felt a shadow trailing them. When they turned around, there was no one there. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The sense that they were walking a path many others had walked before. Those who had become part of the town. Eventually, they came across a large house, one of the few with lights on. Outside, a small wooden sign read "Cautionary Guidance, Ask and Know." It was the first sign of life they had seen in Ashford. The sign felt like an invitation, as if someone inside the house was offering them a chance to understand what was happening. They entered the house, the steps heavy. Inside, a middle-aged man with silver hair and a deeply lined face sat in the living room. He smiled as he saw them, but the smile wasn't warm. It was the smile of someone who had witnessed far too many horrors and could do nothing to stop them. "Welcome," he said, his voice gravelly. "I knew you'd come." The group stood silent, too unsettled to speak. The man seemed like he had been waiting for them for a long time. "You've realized you can't leave this town, haven't you?" he continued. "Ashford is not an ordinary place. It's a resting ground for lost souls. People trapped in memories they can't escape." Jason, unable to hold back, asked, "How do we get out?" The man closed his eyes for a moment, then answered, his tone grave. "You can't. Not unless you face the memories you've forgotten. This entire town is a maze of unreleased memories. And you're part of it now." The group felt like they couldn't breathe. They didn't understand what the man meant, but something deep within them, a strange, powerful instinct, told them it was true. They were no longer who they once were. Unfamiliar memories, vague images, lingered in their minds as if they had lived another life, a life they had forgotten. "This town is a container of memories," the man went on. It will keep repeating again and again until you face the things you cannot remember, the truths buried in your soul. Then, a sudden gust of wind blew open the window. The whistle of air echoed through the silent room. The group stood frozen, feeling as though an invisible force was pulling them into an endless spiral. "There's only one way out," the man said. "You must face the memories you've forgotten. You must face yourselves." At that very moment, a strange sound echoed from the darkness behind the house. They turned to look, but saw nothing but faint shapes and blurred faces, faces that had been wiped away. The group suddenly realized there was no escape, no way back. This town would never let them go, and all they could do now was face the truth they had tried so hard to forget. Story 2. I saw the dead in my reflection. The night rain drizzled like the heavy sighs of something lurking, waiting. Inside the quiet room, the pale yellow glow from the desk lamp cast long shadows over scattered papers, old photographs, and forgotten belongings. Amelia sat in the middle of the room, her fingers gently caressing the surface of an antique mirror she had just received. This gift had changed everything. Just a few days ago, she had received a strange parcel with no return address. Along with it was a single note that read, "Take care of it and it will help you." No name, no explanation. Only the mirror, tucked inside an intricately carved wooden box. At first, she had dismissed it as a worthless antique. But soon, Amelia realized how wrong she had been. The mirror had an eerie beauty, shimmering under the light despite years of fading. Made of stained glass, its frame was adorned with mysterious engravings, unlike anything she had ever seen before. The surface reflected her image clearly, yet something was off. She saw herself, but it wasn't her. Gradually, the reflection in the mirror shifted into a different face. A woman with pale skin and hollow eyes. Amelia gasped, placing the mirror down and jumping to her feet. She looked around the room. A chill filled the air. The atmosphere grew thick, and a gust of cold wind swept through the window. Even though the air was still, she glanced at the mirror again. This time, the face was not just unfamiliar. It was someone she knew. Her mother. But why? Her mother had passed away 2 years ago from an illness that no doctor could cure. Why was her lifeless, soulless image now staring back from the mirror? A wave of fear surged through Amelia. She stared at the mirror in panic, but the reflection shifted again. This time, it was a man. Cold, expressionless. Amelia recognized him instantly. James, her childhood friend, who had mysteriously disappeared 3 months ago. His death had always been a mystery. No one knew where he had gone, no trace left behind. And yet now, his face appeared in this cursed mirror. Amelia's mind reeled. She couldn't make sense of any of it. In a panic, she threw the mirror across the room, but an invisible force dragged her back, trapping her in this unfolding nightmare. At that moment, the door creaked open. A middle-aged man stepped in, face worn, eyes piercing. It was Jack, her cousin. He looked like he'd walked out of a horror movie, and his eyes always made her uneasy. "You shouldn't have touched that mirror," Jack said flatly, his eyes fixed on the mirror lying on the table. "Jack, what do you know about it?" Amelia asked, her voice trembling. But Jack didn't answer. He simply stood there, eyes locked on the mirror. A worried expression she had never seen on him before. Amelia, he said slowly, this isn't just a gift. It's cursed. Anyone who stares into it too long will have their soul taken, and they'll never escape the past. Your mother? James? They're all connected to it. He knelt down, eyes filled with sorrow, as he gazed at the mirror. What are you saying? Amelia's voice cracked with disbelief. None of it made sense. Her mother had died in a hospital. James had vanished in an accident. What was the connection? Jack stepped closer, taking her hand with urgency. You can't look into it anymore, Amelia, or you'll end up just like the others. Your soul will be consumed, and you'll become part of the past. Trapped forever. Spirits that can never move on. A strange sensation crept into Amelia's mind. She began seeing herself in the mirror. Not the person she was now, but another version of her, as if a foreign spirit had taken hold. She looked back at Jack, but he no longer seemed like the cousin she had grown up with. He was now just a hazy figure, as if the mirror had already begun draining his soul. In that chilling moment, Amelia felt terror and hopelessness surge through her. The antique mirror wasn't just an old relic. It was a doorway to a realm of trapped souls. She had unknowingly stepped into a spiral she could not escape. They were calling to her, waiting, and Amelia knew, unless she did something, anything, right now, she would become one of them. This strange gift was never meant to be cherished. It was a curse. Amelia couldn't sleep. The nightmare had begun the moment she looked into the antique mirror, but tonight, everything felt worse. The rain continued to fall outside the window, the drops tapping against the glass like relentless knocks. A sound that made her feel as though someone was standing just beyond the pane. She curled up beneath the covers, trying to shake off the sense of suffocating dread. But it was impossible. Her mind spun with images from the mirror that refused to leave her alone. Her mother, James, strange, unfamiliar faces. They all appeared in last night's dreams. Not just once, but over and over again. A series of looping images, as if trapped in a vortex of time. She couldn't take it anymore. They were trying to pull her into their world. She could feel the shift within herself, something cold crawling deep into her soul. It was silence. It was a hollow void that nothing could fill. Every time she looked into the mirror, she didn't just see her own reflection. She saw the shadows of restless spirits. Amelia decided to get out of bed. She couldn't let herself be consumed by those visions any longer. She hastily threw on her coat and left the room, still clutching the antique mirror Jack had warned her not to look into. But she couldn't stop. A powerful force kept her from letting go of the mirror. It felt as though it had become a part of her, as if it was fused with her soul. She descended the stairs, then walked through the living room, where the dim light from a night lamp still glowed faintly. The house looked strange in the dark. The old paintings on the wall seemed to follow her every step. Amelia felt the presence of something she couldn't explain, a coldness that blanketed the entire space. She paused at the front door, unease rising in her chest. Suddenly, there was a knock, loud, urgent. She turned, eyes wide in panic. No one should be visiting at this hour. She lived alone. So who was knocking? She approached the door. But just as her hand touched the doorknob, a chill wind swept past her from behind, sending a shiver down her spine. She turned around and saw the mirror reflecting an impossible scene. In the mirror stood the figure of a woman behind her, pale-skinned, long black hair covering her face, and eyes glowing blood red. It was her mother. Amelia screamed and spun around, but no one was there. "Don't look into it, Amelia." Jack's raspy voice came from behind her, making her flinch. He stood at the living room entrance, his face pale, his eyes no longer filled with concern, but with sheer terror. You saw something, didn't you?" "What's in the mirror?" Amelia asked, trembling, unable to tear her eyes away from the cursed reflection. Jack stepped closer but refused to look at the mirror. "It's a curse," he said grimly. "Your mother. She's not your mother anymore. The mirror stole her soul. And now it's coming for you." Amelia couldn't breathe. She wanted to run, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. It was like someone, was watching her from every direction. Invisible footsteps crept closer. Then a voice echoed in her head. Not Jack's, but another. A voice of the dead. "Amelia, you can't run. You will become one of us. A soul that can never move on." Her whole body went numb. She looked back at the mirror and saw her mother's face again. But this time, it was no longer familiar. Her mother's eyes burned red, her lips pressed tight, whispering what felt like a curse. She stepped out of the mirror, but what emerged was not her mother. It was a corpse, breathless, lifeless. Amelia couldn't take it anymore. She bolted out of the house, the rain still pouring heavily. She ran, with no idea where to go. She just had to escape that cursed mirror. She felt something chasing her, as though the darkness had swallowed everything she ever loved. When she reached the end of the street, her legs aching, she stopped and took a deep breath. The rain kept falling, the loud splashes of water on the ground, sounding like a voice calling her name. She turned back to look at the house, where the mirror still stood, still reflecting the ghosts of the past. And Amelia understood that there was no running away. Those spirits would never let her go. And the moment she looked into that mirror, it had already claimed her. She had become a part of it. The rain had lasted for 3 straight days. Beneath the dim glow of the streetlights, the entire city was blanketed in a thick fog, like a vast spiderweb stretching in all directions. Amelia had tried to run, but she had returned to the old house. That feeling, an inescapable one, clung to her, as if the house had become a part of her, and the antique mirror, a mysterious relic, had been tied to her fate from the beginning. Amelia sank to the floor, still holding the mirror in her hand. The coldness of it seeped into her skin, a ghostly chill she couldn't shake. Her eyes were drawn to the mirror, even though she tried her best to resist, but an invisible force kept pulling her closer. Then, the image in the mirror began to change again. This time, it wasn't her mother, nor was it James or the other spirits she had seen before. Now, in the mirror, stood a strange man dressed in dull black with a mysterious aura. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, but they were vacant, devoid of emotion. He stood motionless in the mirror, staring straight at her. Only thick silence filled the room, an unsettling sensation, as if he wasn't alive, but a ghost lurking within the mirror. "You can't escape it," the man's voice echoed, tightening Amelia's chest. "It has already claimed you." Amelia trembled. The words didn't sound like a warning, but a declaration of fate. She couldn't run. She couldn't find a way out. He was part of the mirror, and the mirror was part of the imprisoned souls within it. As panic overtook her, the images in the mirror shifted again. This time, there wasn't just one figure, but many. Her mother, James, and several unrecognizable spirits stood within the mirror, all staring at her. Eyes hollow, faces full of challenge. It was as if they had accepted their fate, and now waited to pull her into their world. A world with no escape. A splitting headache crashed down on her, and Amelia felt the world around her begin to collapse. The mirror had seized her mind. Waves of pain surged through her, stealing her breath. Those nightmarish images repeated endlessly in her mind, circling her, enclosing her, leaving no way out. At that moment, a knock echoed through the house. Amelia flinched and turned quickly toward the door. The house remained still. No one was outside. She stood up and walked toward the door. But just as her hand touched the knob, a scream erupted from the living room, sending her into a panic. "There's someone in the house," said a voice, Jack's, her cousin, from the living room. Amelia rushed in, but Jack was nowhere to be seen. Only darkness and the mirror. In the mirror, she saw Jack's reflection. But this time, he wasn't just standing still. He was waving at her, as if urging her to come closer. And then came the terrifying signs. A forced, unnatural smile spread across his face. But it wasn't a human smile. His eyes had turned into two deep black voids, as if there was no soul inside. "Jack, where are you?" Amelia cried. But her voice caught in her throat. It wouldn't come out. Her scream didn't bring a response, only deepened the silence. She stepped closer to the mirror, drawn in by some invisible hand. But when she looked into it again, she realized something. Jack wasn't Jack anymore. He had become one of the trapped souls, just like the others she'd seen in the mirror. "Amelia, you can't escape." Jack's voice rang out in her head. But it wasn't coming from the mirror. It came from behind her. Cold and chilling, Amelia turned, and there he was, standing in front of her. Not the cousin she once knew, but something changed. He had transformed into something else. A specter, stripped of any trace of humanity. He smiled, but not with his mouth. He smiled with his eyes, those deep, bottomless eyes, beckoning her into the world of the dead. You're not Jack," Amelia whispered, stepping back. But her legs wouldn't move. She was paralyzed. She couldn't run. He stepped closer, eyes glowing red like blood. "You can't do anything anymore. You've been drawn in, just like the others. And now, there will be no salvation for you." Amelia felt herself being pulled into an endless spiral. The spirits reappeared, not just in the mirror, but all around her, filling every corner of the house. They surrounded her, one by one, soul by soul. She had no choice left. She was now trapped in the web of unsaved souls. And now, she was one of them. Story 3, There is no exit from the night. It started on a foggy evening. I remember the moment vividly, stepping out of my house, simply wanting to breathe some fresh air after a long, exhausting day. Along the silent street, the streetlights cast long, blurry shadows on the pavement. The sky was overcast, no moon in sight, only a thick blanket of dark clouds hanging above. I didn't think much of it. I just walked, feeling the chill in the air, immersing myself in the stillness of the night. But after a while, I realized I no longer recognized the path I had taken. That shouldn't have been strange in a neighborhood I'd lived in for years. yet the feeling was different. I turned around, trying to orient myself, but when I looked back, the street had completely changed. The houses were no longer familiar. The street lights shone brighter, yet their glow didn't reach the ground. They floated, suspended in midair, making the surroundings feel hazy and cold. The traffic, usually bustling during typical evenings, had vanished. In its place were strange whispers, echoing faintly from somewhere, lingering in the air. I stopped walking. My heart pounded, and an uncomfortable tightness rose in my throat. I tried retracing my steps, heading down the road I believed would lead me home, but nothing looked the way it should. No matter how far I walked, the street remained unchanged. The same distorted houses, the same misaligned lights. The more I walked, the more it felt like space itself refused to shift. I turned again, but the view behind me only deepened the confusion. I was still in the same spot. A sudden gust of cold wind swept past, carrying with it a faint, ghostly sound. I had the overwhelming sensation that someone was watching me. A chill crept down my spine. Each step I took felt like falling deeper into a bottomless void. No light, no direction, no sign that I was moving forward at all. That's when I noticed something terrifying. I had somehow returned to where I started, but time had passed longer than I'd expected. I didn't just feel like I had walked in a circle. I felt like I had stepped into another dimension entirely, one with no end. I looked down at my watch. It still read 2:16 a.m. That can't be, I muttered. That's not how time works. I decided to try again, though I had little hope left. When I looked up, I saw the silhouette of a man in the distance, standing still, silently watching me. My feet froze in place, unwilling to move. He didn't move, didn't seem alive. Just a blurry figure within the darkness. We stared at each other for a few seconds. Then I turned and walked faster. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what would happen if I did. But just as I feared, as I kept walking, something strange occurred. Everything looked exactly the same as before, except for one detail. My watch no longer read 2:16 a.m. Now, it was 3:21 a.m. Confused, I turned around again. The man was still there, but this time, his shadow seemed to be moving, closer, step by step, slowly, steadily. Run, I told myself, but something I couldn't explain rooted my legs in place. I walked, but my steps only led me back to the same starting point. It was as if I were trapped in an endless loop. Time didn't move forward. Space didn't shift. The second night came when I realized the horrifying truth. Each time I returned, it was a new night. Another night with no exit. And every time, I walked past the same houses, saw the same floating lights, and heard the same sighs from within the murky darkness. It seemed I had no choice but to keep walking. Forever? I stopped checking my watch. I didn't want to know what time it was. I didn't want to face the truth that I might never escape this night. This was a loop I couldn't break. A nightmare with no end. In the middle of the night, I realized something even more dreadful. I wasn't the only one caught in this loop. I heard footsteps, not mine. Someone else was walking with me in the dark. I don't know how long I've been walking through that darkness. Time and space, everything had blurred together. Each step I took seemed to lead me right back to where I began. The second night, then the third, I could no longer tell the difference. When I looked up at the sky, the clouds were gone, replaced by an endless void. No stars, no moonlight. I couldn't tell front from back. Couldn't even be sure of where I was standing. There was only darkness and a terrifying silence. But what frightened me more than anything was the feeling that I was not alone. I began to hear other footsteps, steady, soft, as if something was following me. Not mine, not from anyone I knew. It was something else, cold, voiceless. I stopped and looked behind me, but the darkness was too thick. I could see nothing but the faint shadow of myself reflected on the damp road. Still, I kept walking, though each step felt like the wrong decision. Suddenly, a sound echoed behind me. A whisper, faint, unclear, but just enough to make the hair on my neck stand up. It wasn't a voice I could identify. It was more like the wind, or the breath of some hidden creature lurking in the shadows. The words were unintelligible, but so close I felt like I was being watched. Why can't I escape this place? I asked myself, filled with dread. Then, as I stopped walking, a vague silhouette appeared ahead. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, a trick of my disoriented mind, but the figure grew clearer. A person, or something else? I wasn't sure. I stood frozen, staring at the figure. "You're not the first," the whisper came again, this time more distinct. I couldn't take it anymore. The shadow crept closer. That's when I realized it was a woman. Long hair, a faded grey dress. Her clothes were tattered, worn, no longer belonging to the living. Her face was blurry, almost unrecognizable, but her eyes, though hard to see, held an overwhelming fear. They were hollow, as if she had lost everything. Herself, and any hope that remained. "Who are you?" I asked, though I didn't even know what kind of answer I was looking for. She didn't reply. She simply stood there, watching me. I felt an icy sensation spreading through me, like the silence of a graveyard at midnight. Then she raised a trembling hand and pointed into the distance, towards something I couldn't see. "Go," she said, her voice quivering. "You won't escape." Her words felt like a prophecy. I looked in the direction she pointed and saw nothing, just a black void with no sign of a way out. And yet something was there. A cold wind pulling me forward, as if forcing me to continue. I looked back at the girl, but she had vanished. Not walked away. Vanished, like a mist dissolving into the night. That strange freezing sensation clung to me with every step. I no longer knew where I was going. The darkness, the strange footsteps, the unending whispers, they all formed a never-ending loop. I started to feel tired, like life was slowly draining from me. The feeling of being unable to escape made me panic. I didn't know if there truly was a way out of this night. Then, the hair on the back of my neck stood up again, as I realized something horrifying. I wasn't just trapped in space. I was trapped in time. The watch on my wrist never changed. No matter how far I walked, how many times I turned back, I couldn't move time forward. Every time I checked, it still read 2:16 a.m. I couldn't get out. I couldn't change a thing. So I kept walking, because there was no other choice. And then suddenly, I noticed something terrifying. The houses around me weren't just unfamiliar. They were empty, not just abandoned. Wrong. Every time I passed one and looked back, it had changed. The doors had no locks. The windows were sealed shut. And from inside, strange noises echoed out. These were not houses I had ever known. They were shifting, living in a cruel, sentient way, as if they intended to consume me. Suddenly, a door creaked open. not because of the wind or any natural cause. It opened because I looked at it. A man stepped out. Not someone I recognized, but still, oddly familiar. His face was strange, unplaceable, but his eyes were full of fear, like someone who knew he'd never escape. "You're trapped too, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low and weary. I nodded, but I didn't know what to say. We just stood there, looking at each other, lost in a night with no exit. I don't remember how long I had been standing there, next to the strange man, in a place devoid of life but filled with unspeakable horror. The doors of shattered houses hung crookedly. Walls were peeling in chunks, layers of decayed paint flaking away, and the air was soaked in a coldness I couldn't describe. I looked into his eyes, and in them I saw despair, as though he had been living in this darkness for decades. And yet, for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt an overwhelming urge, an inexplicable compulsion to keep moving. I had to walk, even if I didn't know where I was going, even if there was no escape. We didn't say anything more. Silence swallowed everything, so dense it felt like nothing existed but the sound of our own ragged breathing. I looked ahead, but there was nothing but ruined houses, utterly deserted. Then I realized something far more disturbing. The houses weren't just abandoned. They had begun to warp, as if devouring the very space around them. The doors, the windows, all shut tight, yet emitted soft noises, as though something was moving inside. "We have to go," I said suddenly, though I didn't know where the urgency came from. My words startled him, as if he had just woken from a long sleep. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting a man who had forgotten the concept of time. "Go where?" he asked, his voice a weary sigh, steeped in helplessness. I didn't answer. I just knew I had to move, though I didn't understand why. But as we stepped forward, I noticed something unsettling. Nothing changed. The road remained the same. The houses didn't shift. Darkness still cloaked everything around us. I couldn't remember how long I'd walked, but each step only brought me back to where I had started. A cold wind suddenly swept through, brushing across my skin like icy breath. Then I heard something strange behind me. I turned, and what I saw made my breath catch. The sky above us had opened wide, revealing a darkness deeper than anything I had ever known. With every step I took, the shadows around me seemed to shrink and tighten, pulling me into another space, unfamiliar but eerily familiar. It was a feeling I had experienced before, in strange dreams I could never remember, yet they haunted me endlessly. When I turned again, I saw another figure standing behind us. She wasn't the woman I had seen before. She was thinner, dressed in a long white gown, and her face was covered in wounds, as if she had been trapped in a nightmare that stretched on for years. She stood in complete silence, yet I could feel something radiating from her, a chilling energy slowly spreading across the space. Her footsteps made no sound. She simply stared at me. Her eyes were vacant, like she was waiting for me to do something. "You won't escape," she said, her voice soft as the wind. At that moment, I couldn't move. I stood frozen, wrapped in fear. Strange images began flashing in my mind. A nighttime scene with ghosts drifting by. A man standing on a bridge, turning to look at me. But I couldn't remember who he was. These images kept repeating, like a vortex I couldn't break. "Don't look into her eyes," the strange man finally spoke, his voice tight with anxiety. "If you do, you'll be trapped in this loop forever." I didn't understand what he meant, but his warning felt like a sharp blade cutting straight through my chest. I turned back, but I couldn't stop myself from meeting her gaze. And the moment I did, I felt it, that invasion, that overwhelming pull I couldn't resist. Her eyes were drawing me into a bottomless abyss, a place with no life, no light, only darkness and emptiness. I tried to turn away, to retreat, but as I moved, I felt a strange weight fall over me. My body no longer responded, as if caught in an invisible web. My steps didn't carry me forward. They dragged me back, to the same place. There was no exit, no way out. A long, weary sigh echoed from behind me, making me jump. The woman had vanished, leaving only distant whispers from the surrounding shadows. I looked up, and this time I saw a house, so close, so clear. Its door stood wide open, but no light came from within. Yet something about it called to me, as though the house itself had been waiting. But I didn't dare enter. I could feel it. Each step toward that house would pull me deeper into the cycle. Forever. It was an indescribable sensation, like standing between two worlds, unable to escape, but unable to go back. And the night never ends. Story 4, Death Reborn. I can never forget that day. It was like a nightmare, but one that never ends. I remember every second, every minute of the accident. But after I woke up, I realized something horrifying. I had never truly died. We, my classmates and I, had just left our graduation ceremony. The familiar road home felt endlessly long that evening. We laughed, chatted, completely unaware that it would be the last moment I'd ever spend in this body. A truck sped out from the intersection. Everything happened in an instant. The deafening crush of metal against metal, shattering glass, screaming. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the starry night sky was gone. Instead, I found myself in a sterile white room. The stench of disinfectant thick in the air. A soft voice came from beside the bed. It was a doctor. They told me I had awakened after a serious accident and that I had come so close to dying. But I survived. At the time, I didn't think too deeply about the fact that I was still alive. I only felt that my body was light, almost like it no longer belonged to me. But the truth remained. I was alive. When the doctor left the room, I tried to sit up. My legs trembled, unfamiliar, like I had never walked before. Everything around me felt distant. Even the most familiar things. Days passed. I lived in the hospital, haunted by the strange feeling of being watched. The nurses and doctors acted oddly. They looked at me, but their eyes never showed full concern. There was something behind those glances. Something unnerving. Each time I felt their eyes on me, a cold dread settled in my chest. Then I met him, a doctor named David, who had been assigned to care for me during my recovery. He was always kind, treating me as if I was someone special. But there was something I couldn't explain. He always looked at me with a gaze full of curiosity, like he was studying me. When I asked about the accident, he only offered a forced smile and said I was lucky to have survived. But there was one thing he said that haunted me. You'll soon realize. Death is not an ending. Those words brought me no comfort. Every night, I dreamed of standing on a bridge, staring down at a dark river. Faint shadows drifted below, and I would feel a cold hand touch my shoulder. A rising sense of dread filled me. And during the late hours of the night, when I awoke, I'd still be in that hospital room. But sometimes I would hear strange sounds nearby, whispers, as if someone was standing next to me. But when I turned around, no one was there. That feeling grew stronger with each passing day. It was as if I was no longer myself. My every action, every thought, felt like it was being controlled by something unseen. I no longer felt like my body belonged to me. When I looked into the mirror, the face was familiar, but not quite right. My features were dull. My eyes stared back with emptiness, as if my soul had slipped away. One day, I decided to leave the hospital, even though I knew deep down I was no longer normal. I had to find the truth. But the moment I stepped outside, something strange happened. Everyone looked at me as if they had never seen me before. Strangers' eyes, awkward smiles. Yet I knew them. They were the most familiar people in my life. When I returned home, everything was different. The house I had lived in with my family now felt foreign, filled with the coldness of distance. My mother, the person I loved most, looked at me with sorrow in her eyes, as if I was someone entirely different. She told me I was no longer her daughter. Those words made me shiver. What had I done wrong? Why had everything changed so drastically? Then it dawned on me. What I was going through was not a return to life. It was a rebirth. Death had never truly come for me. Instead, I had been reborn into a different body. A body not entirely my own. And the more terrifying truth was this. I didn't know what I was going to face next. Life was not a salvation. It was a journey through shadows, filled with secrets left in the dark. When night falls, I dream of that bridge again. Ghosts, shadowy figures drifting by, and a voice that echoes deep within my mind. You didn't die, but you will never truly live again. Everything has changed. And now, I can feel the presence of something I can't explain, watching me with every step I take, every gesture, every move I make. Feels like it's already been planned. I'm no longer in control. Death never truly came for me, but I can feel it, closer than ever. Time passed, but I couldn't forget what I had experienced. The feeling of living in a body that didn't feel like my own, facing familiar people who looked at me as if I were a stranger. It was all too much to bear. But the more I tried to understand, the more I realized there were things I was never meant to know. The first night back home, I couldn't sleep. The whispers in my head kept repeating, as if a voice was waiting for me to uncover secrets I didn't want to discover. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the change in my eyes. That sharpness was gone. It wasn't me anymore. It was someone else entirely. My face seemed to be morphing into something new. And the most terrifying part was that I couldn't control it. One afternoon, as I sat in the living room, my mother came over and looked at me with concern in her eyes. She called my name, but not the one I had always known. She called me Sarah, a name I had never heard before in my entire life. That name hit me like a knife to the mind, leaving me speechless. My mother's eyes were filled with tears, and I could only stand there, utterly confused. Mom, I finally spoke, but my voice sounded nothing like before. It was hoarse, cold, as if someone or something else was speaking through me. She stepped back, eyes wide with fear. You're not my daughter. Are you? Her words made me tremble. I couldn't understand. What had I done wrong? Why would she say that? Was I no longer myself? In that moment, I felt my body grow heavy, as if a nameless shadow had taken residence inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling. That entire night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Sleep was impossible, and the harder I tried, the more vivid the strange images became. Unfamiliar faces, inexplicable scenes, and ghosts whispering through the dark corners of the house. Shadowy figures glided past me, as if watching my every move. The next morning, as I went out to get food, I ran into an old friend, Jake. He was the first person I saw after the accident, and the only one who didn't seem to look at me differently. Jake said he remembered me well, but there was something odd about the way he looked at me, like he was searching for something in my eyes, something he couldn't explain. "Sarah," Jake said, calling me by that unfamiliar name. "Do you remember anything about the accident?" I shook my head. Nothing came to me. But the mention of the accident stirred something strange inside me, as if a truth was buried just beneath the surface. Something I wasn't ready to face. Jake pulled me into a nearby cafe, and we sat down to talk. Even while speaking, his eyes never left mine. He looked at me like he was trying to unlock a truth I didn't understand. After a while, Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photo. It was a picture of me and him, along with our group of friends from high school. But there was something odd about it. I wasn't smiling in the photo. I was just standing there, eyes empty, as if I already knew what was going to happen. "Sarah," Jake said again, "why did you look like that in the photo? Don't you remember? We used to have fun together." I didn't answer. His words made me feel like something was very wrong. The name Sarah, the photo, the strange feeling in my own body, they were all pieces of a puzzle I couldn't piece together. Just then, my phone rang, startling me. It was Dr. David. The sound of his name made my skin crawl. I had felt something off about him before. And this time, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what he had to say. I answered, and his voice came through the line. "Sarah, I think you need to see me. There are things you don't know about the accident, and I need to explain them to you." He didn't call me by my real name. He called me Sarah, that strange, haunting name. Then he told me to meet him at the hospital that evening. The rest of that day was filled with unbearable anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was clinging to me, something watching my every move. That feeling grew even stronger when I stepped into the hospital that night. When I entered Dr. David's office, the room felt frozen in time. He stood there in silence, his eyes cold, heavy with truths that had yet to be revealed. "Sarah," he began, "you may have died, but you can't leave this place." A chilling sensation swept through my mind. His words were a warning, a truth I never wanted to confront. But deep down, I knew I couldn't go back. Death wasn't the end for me. It was only the beginning of another nightmare. I never thought I would return to that hospital, the place where I woke up after the accident, where I first felt the terrifying sense that I was no longer myself. But that night, following Dr. David's request, I went back. The room he had chosen for our meeting was on the 3rd floor of the old wing at St. Harold's Hospital, a section that had been abandoned for nearly 8 years after a minor fire, now used only for storage. I stepped inside. The hallway lights flickered like they were on the verge of burning out. The air was freezing, heavy with mold, and everything was shrouded in an unsettling silence. No patients, no staff, only the echo of my own footsteps reverberating through the empty halls. The door to room 313B creaked open on its own. I hadn't touched it. I froze. David was already there, but he wasn't sitting at the desk like last time. He was standing, back turned to me, staring at a blank wall. "What do you feel when night falls, Sarah?" he asked without turning around. I shivered. "I'm not Sarah. You are what's left of a soul that never finished its journey," he cut in, his voice calm, but as cold and sharp as steel. "And the remnants are rarely left in peace." I started to back away, but he turned around, holding a stack of old files. He tossed them onto the table. "I treated a girl named Sarah Matthews 3 years ago. She died in a car crash, but her body was never found in full. Her head was missing. Still hasn't been found. Until now, I felt sick. Fragmented memories came rushing back. Spilled blood, the wail of sirens, headlights blinding my eyes, and a scream. But I had never been called Sarah. Why are you telling me this?" I choked out. "Because you're in Sarah's body." That sentence hit like a thunderclap. I staggered back, my heart pounding wildly. "No, that's not possible." David gave a thin smile, a smile devoid of any comfort. "Your accident happened at the exact same location Sarah died. I found the coincidence after reviewing your blood work and her old medical file. You didn't just survive. You replaced her." I wanted to scream, but my throat clenched shut. My skin broke into goosebumps, not from the cold, but from the truth unraveling before me. "But why? How could that even happen?" David stepped closer. "Because of a ritual. A miscast summoning performed on a rainy night by people trying to call back a loved one's spirit. But they got the wrong one. They opened a gate that was never meant to be opened." He pulled back a curtain, revealing behind the wall a rusted iron door, ancient, flaking with decay, marked with strange symbols drawn in what looked like dried blood. "Beneath this basement is where the ritual took place, and I believe you need to go down there to understand who you truly are." I hesitated. Every cell in my body screamed no, but something deeper inside me, something I couldn't explain, urged me forward. The basement was pitch black, no power. Only the beam from David's flashlight lit our way. Every step on the wooden stairs creaked like a cry from the dead. At last, we reached a small chamber, crudely built into the earth. Latin phrases were scrawled across the walls. I couldn't read them, but they bled a sense of death and damnation. At the center of the room was a cold stone table, a soot-drawn circle surrounding it, and in the middle, a human skull cracked on one side. I trembled, gasping for breath. My heart felt like it had stopped. "Is that Sarah?" David nodded. "Part of her soul never passed on. It searched for a new vessel, and by chance, you became the container." I didn't know whether to cry or run. A sob rang out behind me, making me whip around. But there was no one there, only darkness. Footsteps echoed, but not mine, not David's. Then I heard a whisper, a girl's voice. "Give it back. Give me back my body." David stepped back. She's beginning to sense her presence in you. And now, she's waking up." Suddenly, the flashlight began flickering violently before cutting out. I screamed into the darkness. David shouted too. "Don't let her re-enter the body. If she does..." A violent force shoved me from behind. I fell hard onto the stone floor, my head slamming into the table's edge. Everything blurred. In that liminal space between consciousness and unconsciousness, I saw a face, one that looked like mine, but wasn't, staring back at me with a chilling smile. "Stop resisting," the voice echoed inside my head. "We are one. You live because I haven't left yet." Then the darkness consumed me. I woke up in a hospital room again, but this time, everything was different. No David. No one called me Sarah anymore. Only doctors telling me I had amnesia from the crash. But I knew the truth pulsed beneath my skin. I was no longer me, and that thing inside me, it's still there, waiting for the day it fully takes over this body. And next time, I fear I won't wake up as myself again. Story 5. The Wounds That Refuse to Heal. I woke up in a hospital in Portland, Oregon, surrounded by the chaos of beeping monitors, murmurs from the hallway, and the sharp sting of antiseptic in every breath. The white overhead lights bathed my pale skin, and the first thing I felt as consciousness returned wasn't pain. It was an unbearable emptiness. The accident had happened on a rainy October night, as I was driving back from a short business trip to Salem. A truck ran a red light and slammed into the side of my Camry, flinging me off the highway like a broken doll. I don't remember that moment, but every night since I woke up, it returns in my dreams. The blinding glare of headlights, the shriek of twisting metal like a voiceless scream, and then darkness when I was moved out of the ICU. The doctors told me the strangest part wasn't that I had survived. It was that every injury on my body was healing, except one. A 2-inch gash along my left rib cage, not deep, not infected. But no matter how many times they dressed it, no matter how strong the antibiotics, it refused to close. The bleeding had stopped, but the skin wouldn't knit. Instead, a dark crust of dried blood clung to it like a layer of oil paint on canvas. Unyielding, wrong, as though it didn't belong to me. "Your body's reacting abnormally," said Dr. Jacobs, a gaunt man with hollowed eyes, while examining the wound. "No signs of infection, no internal damage, but it won't heal. We've never seen anything like this." I only nodded. I didn't tell him that every time I looked at the wound, that odorless, tasteless patch of dried blood lying still beneath the skin. I felt like my soul was being drained, little by little. Each morning I woke up, I felt like a part of me had been shaved away. 3 weeks after discharge, I returned to my small apartment in South Portland. I lived alone. No husband, no close friends, just a few co-workers from my old office. They sent cards, some visited, but they faded away like mist, leaving only me, and the wound that wouldn't heal, and the dread growing deeper by the day. The first night back, I stood in front of the mirror. My thin white nightgown couldn't hide the crusted blood, a stain that refused to wash out. I tried wiping it away with a towel. It didn't come off. I picked at it with a needle. It had fused to the flesh, pulsing as if something beneath was breathing. That's when I started hearing whispers in the night, not in my head, not hallucinations, real whispers. "It's not finished. It needs new blood." I turned every light on, searched every corner of the room. No one. But the whispers didn't disappear. They only receded, slithering into the shadows, into the closet, behind the curtain, beneath the bed. The next week I met with a therapist, a young woman named Clara, still in training at a center in the suburbs of Lake Oswego. I told her about the whispers, about how I felt like I was slowly being drained. She didn't laugh. She didn't rush to diagnose. Instead, she asked something that made my blood freeze. Has anyone talked to you about your near-death experience? I shook my head. She lowered her voice, almost as if speaking too loudly might summon something into the room. When someone nearly dies, sometimes things don't let go. Maybe a part of you didn't come back alone. I shuddered. That night I dreamed of a long, dark corridor. At the far end was a rotting wooden door, and beyond it, I knew, somehow, was the place I nearly never returned from. A hand reached out from the crack, covered in blood, and pointed at the wound on my side. I'm borrowing your body. I woke up to find a pool of blood soaked into my bedsheet, but not fresh blood. Dried blood, as if someone had poured it there long ago. The metallic scent filled my nostrils, and the wound, unchanged, not deeper, not better. I began keeping a journal, recording each day, each dream, each time the whispers returned. But something strange began to happen. My morning entries didn't match what I read at night. New sentences appeared, in handwriting that wasn't mine. Don't let the light find me. Only in the dark can I truly be myself. I brought the journal to Clara. She went pale. Have you ever heard of someone named Mabel? I shook my head. She pulled out an old file from her desk drawer. It was a case file, an accident report from 1983. A girl named Mabel Johnston, killed in a car crash. The same stretch of road I'd been on. She was trapped in her car. No one arrived in time. Her body was never found. Only a long smear of blood left on the asphalt. When I saw the faded photo of Mabel, my heart nearly stopped. Those eyes, that stare, I'd seen it, not in the mirror, but in the darkness beneath my bed, every time the whispers came back. I'm not alone, and maybe I've never truly been me again. I don't remember exactly when I started fearing mirrors. Maybe it was the first time I saw Mabel's face reflected in one instead of my own. My eyes were still mine, light brown, slightly upturned, but the gaze, it wasn't. It was something else, cold, arrogant, as if it knew more than I did, had lived longer than I had, and was waiting for something. After meeting with Clara, I returned to my apartment, carrying the old photo of Mabel and the copied accident report she had given me. The paper was thin, yellowed with age, neatly stapled. The typewritten lines detailed the crash. Time, location, witness statements, all terrifyingly identical to my own accident. The same curve on Route 47, the same truck, the same torrential rain that night. The only difference was, I survived. Mabel didn't. Clara told me I shouldn't be alone for too long. She suggested I leave the city for a while. Stay with someone, or rent a place somewhere quiet, close to nature, as far from urban life as possible. But I had no one. No close family. No relatives. My parents died in a fire when I was 15. I was raised by an aunt who passed away a few years ago from a stroke. So I chose a small town called Granite Hollow, over 3 hours north of Portland, hidden in a dense pine forest in northern Oregon. I rented an old cabin online, an abandoned lakeside lodge from the 1970s, now listed at a cheap rate by a real estate company. I arrived on a foggy afternoon. The sky was void of sunlight, just a dull, heavy gray. The pine trees loomed overhead, swaying in the wind like they were whispering secrets to one another. The cabin nestled on a gentle slope beside a perfectly still lake. No ripples, No bird song. But strangely, the moment I stepped inside, a sharp pain shot through the wound on my side. I collapsed onto the creaky wooden floor, vision spinning for a few seconds. I knew then. Mabel didn't like this place. That night I dreamed I was lying underground. No coffin, no burial. Just a bare, cold body, hastily covered in damp forest soil. I tried to move, but my limbs didn't respond. The darkness pressed in, thick like mud, and I heard voices above. "Keep her here. We need that body." I woke up to knocking. 3 knocks. Then silence. Then 3 more. I glanced at the clock. 2:16 a.m. This time, I didn't open the door. Instead, I checked every window, every lock around the cabin. No one was there. The lake remained glass still, and the darkness in the woods felt alive, watching me. I texted Clara, briefly mentioning the dream and the knocking. She replied with just one line: "Don't let her in, no matter what." The next day, I found a small room in the back of the cabin, hidden behind an old curtain and a toppled bookcase. When I cleared away the mess, I uncovered a moldy rug. Beneath it, a rotting wooden trapdoor. The handle was rusted, but I managed to pry it open. A foul stench burst upward the moment it opened. The smell of wet soil, tangled roots, and something else, something like rotting flesh. I shined my flashlight down and saw wooden steps leading into pitch black below. I don't know why, but part of me was drawn to descend. 3 steps in, my flashlight flickered. By the 7th, I heard breathing. Not mine, not close. It echoed from the walls, the ground, the air itself. I turned to climb back up. That's when I saw it, something sitting on the edge of the hatch. A blurry silhouette, long hair hanging down, eyes wide open, like black, hollow pits. Mabel. I ran. That night the wound on my side bled, for the first time since the hospital. But it wasn't fresh red. It was a dark, brownish black, like dried blood. And it didn't stop. It dripped all night. I dreamed I was standing before a rotting wooden bridge stretching over a bottomless pool of black water. Mabel stood on the far side, waving me over. Behind her were countless figures, faceless, handless, just thick shadows like dense smoke. "You've stepped beyond the boundary," Mabel said. Her voice was the same as the one from the mirror. "Now I just need to give you a little push." I jolted awake to violent knocking. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Pause. I screamed, "I won't let you in." Silence. I looked down. The wound had closed. No more dried blood. No more pain. Only a name carved into my flesh with a fingernail. Mabel. I left the cabin the next morning after a sleepless night. The lake was still eerily calm, and the morning light seemed unable to penetrate the air around me. It didn't make things brighter, only gave the darkness sharper edges. The name Mabel, etched into my skin, though scrubbed raw, remained as if it were a natural part of my body. The wound no longer hurt, but in its place was something worse. A growing numbness, cold from within, like a hidden glacier expanding inside my chest, trapping me in a shell that wasn't mine. I decided to leave Granite Hollow to uncover Mabel's past. Clara had stopped replying. Her number had been disconnected. When I visited her office in Lake Oswego, I was told she had taken emergency leave and left the state. No farewell, no explanation. The feeling of being abandoned in a waking nightmare had never been clearer. I went to the Salem Town Hall where Mabel had once lived. It took nearly half a day of digging through dusty, cobweb-covered records before I found a trace. An old address, 2934 Willow Creek Road. A house deep within an eastern neighborhood, now owned by an elderly man named Eugene Crawley. I arrived late in the afternoon. Rain clouds rolled in, wind whistling through the trees like quiet sobs. The house was aged and worn, its roof blanketed with moss, windows covered in burlap cloth. I knocked 3 times, using the same rhythm I'd heard at the cabin. After a moment, the door cracked open. An old eye peered at me through the darkness. You're one of the survivors," the man said, his voice trembling. I froze. "You know who I am?" I asked. "I don't need your name," he replied. "I just have to see your eyes. And that mark on your body, it's the same one Mabel had." He invited me inside. The interior felt devoured by time. The air reeked of stale tobacco and rotting wood. Eugene poured me a cup of lukewarm tea and sank into an armchair across from me, his gaze piercing straight through me. "I used to be a cop," he said. "I was the first to arrive at Mabel's crash site. I saw her trapped inside the car. Blood, not much of it, but there was something in her eyes that haunted me for months after." I swallowed hard, clutching the teacup. "She died, didn't she?" He shook his head slowly. "Her body was never found. When the car was towed, the driver's door was wide open. Blood on the seat, but no body. No drag marks, no signs of animals. Mabel vanished." I told him about the cabin, the whispers, the unhealed bloodstains, the dreams. His face went pale, hands trembling. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a long dark scar identical to mine. "You're not the only one," he whispered. "I was marked too. I carved Mabel's name into my own arm. During a night I can't remember. I gave up everything, my wife, my kids, my career, just to stay alive." I asked him how he escaped. He was silent for a long time. "There's no escape," he finally said. "Only survival. You're just the next vessel. But you're different. You went into the basement under the cabin, didn't you?" I nodded, heart pounding. "You opened that door. Then it's no longer just Mabel." I left the house in a panic, my mind spinning. Mabel wasn't the only entity. That cabin, that basement, was a gate. And somehow, I was the one who unlocked it. That night I rented a small motel room on the outskirts of town. The place was shabby, but the door had a solid lock. I barricaded myself inside. Lights on all night, but at 2:16 a.m., the knocking came again. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. I stayed silent, unmoving. But this time, there was no retreating. Just a scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across the door. Then a voice whispered through the crack, "It's not just Mabel." I stood up and walked to the bathroom mirror. For the first time, I saw that the reflection behind me wasn't just my own. Mabel stood near my left shoulder. But on the right, another figure, taller, twisted face, a mouth torn wide to the ears. Its eyes were 2 black pits, swallowing light. I turned around. No one there, only in the mirror. I screamed, hurling the mirror to the floor. It shattered. But even without a mirror, I knew it was still there. Another entity. Another haunting. The door had been opened. Story 6, Room 313. He's not me, but I'm not me anymore. I moved into Morgan Hall in the fall of my sophomore year. A weathered red brick dormitory, tucked away on the edge of the campus in northern Maine. Built in the 1950s, Morgan Hall had the stoic look of a miniature fortress. Narrow hallways, solid walnut doors, and a lingering smell of plaster and aging wallpaper, as if everything here had decayed long ago but stubbornly clung to its form. I was assigned to room 313, at the very end of the third-floor hallway, the loneliest room in the building, sitting right beside an old storage space that people still whispered about using a strange name, the doorless room. At first, I thought it was just some eerie nickname students came up with to scare freshmen. But then I realized it was real. There was indeed an empty space between rooms 311 and 313. No door, no room number. Just a strange section of wall, oddly flat and discolored, as if someone had sealed off a part of reality behind a thick layer of cement. I'm not a superstitious person, but something felt wrong on my very first night. At exactly 2:41 a.m., I was half asleep when I heard a soft sound, like fingernails gently scratching the wall. Not mice, not pipes, fingernails. I lay still, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then, just seconds later, came a faint voice. Eli! Eli! I shot upright. The room was empty. The door was locked. The nightlight blinked its weak orange glow. I told myself it was just a dream. Stress from the new semester, that's all. But it wasn't the last time. The voice returned every night, always between 2:30 and 3 a.m. Sometimes it was a breeze-like whisper. Other times it sounded strained, like someone trying to call my name from behind a thick wall of brick. I told Sam about it. He was in my graphic design class, the only real friend I'd made here. His brow furrowed when I mentioned room 313. You know what happened there in '84, right? Sam asked quietly. I shook my head. There was a student, Matthew Klein. He lived in that room, vanished without a trace over Thanksgiving break. The room next door used to be a maintenance space, later converted into storage. Then they sealed it off. Some people said they heard screams, like someone begging for help, but the police found nothing. Cameras back then were crap, but there was one phone recording from the dorm's switchboard. Someone called and said, "I'm trapped, in the wall." A chill ran down my spine. The name Matthew Klein started to haunt me, and stranger still, the voice calling my name each night began to change. At first, it was just a whisper, but over time, it began to mimic my own voice. I don't know how, but one night I awoke to hear my own voice whispering in my ear, "Eli, come closer." I started recording at night. One recording lasted 17 minutes, in which the same whisper repeated every 30 seconds. No scratching, just a single line, over and over. "Why won't you help me? You know who I am, Eli. I was left behind." I played the audio for Sam. He went pale, completely speechless. One Saturday evening, Sam invited me to the campus library, where they kept archived student records. We found the 1984 dorm roster. Just like he said, room 313 had been assigned to Matthew Klein. What chilled me was a tiny red note scrawled beside it, permanently reassigned, "Do not reuse." We searched for pictures, personal records, anything. In a stack of old documents, I found a clipping from the school newspaper. Philosophy freshman Matthew Klein once submitted an essay on the concept of sealed spaces, places where souls could become eternally trapped if severed from physical reality. That night, I didn't return to my room. I slept in Sam's, but the dream still came. I saw myself standing before the sealed wall. My hand trembled as I touched the cold cement. Suddenly, from the other side, I heard a scream, no longer a whisper. It was my voice. Clear, desperate. I screamed in my dream. I saw another version of me. Skin ghostly white, eyes bleeding, hands pounding furiously on the wall. I woke up with a bruise on my finger, like I'd slammed it hard against something in my sleep. After that, everything got worse. I heard footsteps in my room while I studied. Lights flickered constantly. One night, my phone turned on by itself and began recording. Another time, I checked my night vision camera and saw a figure standing at the doorless wall, wearing the same hoodie I had hung on my coat rack. Then, one night, at exactly 2:16 a.m., stranger than all the rest, the voice came again, but not from the wall. It came from inside my head. There was no sound in the room, but I could feel the scream, like it burst from deep within my mind. "I'm inside you." I bolted from my room, barefoot, no jacket, running like a madman down the dark hallway until I collapsed at the stairwell. The dorm manager had to take me to the campus infirmary. I wouldn't stop shaking. I kept whispering over and over, "I can hear myself dying." But the worst part, the truly terrifying part, was this. When the doctor asked me, "What's your name?" I hesitated. I wanted to say Eli, but my mouth said Matthew Klein. I left the student hospital the following afternoon after nearly 14 hours under constant observation. They concluded that I was in a state of acute anxiety, possibly tied to prolonged insomnia. But no one could explain why my pulse was so unusually slow that the vital signs monitor had to double-check twice. And no one mentioned the phrase I kept repeating during my panic attack. "I'm Matthew. He's trying to get out." I didn't have the courage to return to room 313 alone. Sam had to come with me to collect my things, though even he looked disturbed. The door creaked open, and almost immediately, the smell hit us. Damp mold mixed with something harsher, like rusted metal and dried blood. I looked around. Nothing in the room had changed, but there was a thin, hairline crack running along the sealed wall. I'd never noticed it before. As I stepped closer, Sam suddenly grabbed my arm. "Eli, look!" Sam pointed toward the ceiling corner. "Has anyone ever drawn anything up there?" I looked up and saw faint scratch marks, interlocking circles. It wasn't clear what had made them. Fingernails, a small blade, or a trembling finger from inside. Under the dim light, I could make it out more clearly. A symbol resembling a human eye, wide open, blankly staring. Sam vomited on the spot when we heard the faintest whisper from the crack in the wall. "It's not me." We didn't say another word. I moved out that same night, down to the first floor, into an old vacant room that had been empty since the start of the semester. The dorm manager quietly signed the transfer paperwork. No questions, no comments. Her eyes skimmed over me like I wasn't the first person to ask to leave that room. I thought it would end there. But on my first night in the new room, I woke up at 2:17 a.m., heart pounding as if I'd just sprinted a mile. I sat up, hand to my forehead, and noticed my wrist was bruised, right where it had slammed against the wall the night I hallucinated. I reached for my phone. The voice recorder was running. Even though I deleted the app 2 days ago, the recording was 3 minutes long. At first, just heavy breathing, then at second 58, a whisper. "The door's opening, Eli. It's coming apart." I hurled the phone into the wall. The next day, I returned to the library alone. Sam didn't want to be involved anymore. In the old archives, I found a floor plan of Morgan Hall, dated 1982, 2 years before the sealed room was reconstructed. According to the layout, the sealed section used to be a soundproof practice room for music majors, built with double brick walls, a thick acoustic door, and only one entrance. I also found a restricted internal report. On-campus disappearance M. Klein, for internal use, senior staff only. I photographed every page. One detail had never been released publicly. Several students reported hearing their names called at night, right before Matthew vanished. Fear spread like an incurable infection. Thursday night, I was awoken by knocking. Not once, but 3 even taps, repeated 3 times. I opened the door. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, just beyond the threshold, was a crumpled scrap of paper. So old, it was nearly disintegrating. Hands shaking, I unfolded it. The ink was smudged, but still legible. There are 2 people inside you. I froze for a few seconds, my mind blank, then turned back into the room. On the bathroom mirror, scrawled in something like black paint, "Or dried blood," were the words. "He's asleep. When he wakes up, you won't be here anymore." I screamed, but by the time Sam rushed in, everything was gone. No message on the mirror, no paper on the floor, no knocking sounds. I began to doubt myself. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the sleepless nights, the voices, and the hazy memories of someone named Matthew were all just delusions. But then something happened I couldn't deny. Saturday night, I received a strange email from an untraceable address. No message, just a subject line. 3:13. He's still there. Attached was a grainy infrared video. I clicked play. It showed the 3rd floor hallway of Morgan Hall. Nothing happened for the first 10 seconds. Then, the wall between rooms 311 and 313, once flat, began to tremble. I saw the cracks widen, plaster peeled away. And then, a pale, bony hand emerged from the wall. I couldn't breathe. My eyes stayed glued to the screen. The hand trembled, reaching outward, its fingers curling as if beckoning someone closer. Then a face appeared, eyeless, mouth wide open in a silent scream. The video ended on a still frame. Room 313, door wide open, nothing but darkness inside. I ran to Morgan Hall that night, a crowbar borrowed from the maintenance room in hand. I had to know the truth. I had to prove I wasn't insane. Sam followed me. He knew I was about to do something reckless. And even terrified, he wouldn't let me face it alone. We stood in front of the sealed wall. I took a deep breath and slammed the crowbar into the cracked cement. The wall was thinner than I thought. A large chunk crumbled away, revealing dark red bricks underneath. I struck again. On the 3rd blow, the bricks gave way. Inside was nothing but shadow, no furniture, no sound, just the stench of mold and a dense, stagnant emptiness. Then from the darkness, a voice spoke. My voice. "You finally came." I stood paralyzed. My hands trembled. The crowbar clattered to the floor, and in that moment, I saw it. A second version of me, stepping forward from the blackness. Its eyes were empty, its smile wide, and its mouth moved. Time to trade places, Eli. There are moments when you think you're ready, and then you realize no one is ever truly ready to see themselves step out of the darkness, with hollow eyes and a crooked smile. I don't remember exactly how I stepped back. My body reacted faster than my thoughts. The crowbar clattered to the floor with a cold, sharp clang, then fell silent, as if swallowed. Sam yanked me backward, stammering, "Run, run!" But my legs wouldn't move. I kept staring at that shadow, a replica of me. It didn't lunge forward. It just stood there, giving a slow nod, as if confirming, "I saw you. You saw me. There's no going back now." We locked the door to room 313, triple locked it, and fled Morgan Hall in the middle of the night. I didn't sleep, couldn't, and worse, the voice no longer came from the walls. It followed me. The next morning, Sam brought me to the small church beside the old dormitory block. The pastor was an elderly Irishman named Callahan, who had served the school for nearly 40 years. When I told him only parts of what had happened, he didn't laugh. He didn't question. He quietly invited us into his office and locked the door from the inside. "There are places that used to be doors," he said softly, pouring tea. "Not ordinary doors, but cracks, where the boundary between what we understand and what we never should has worn thin. Morgan Hall was one of those places, but people chose not to speak of it, simply because there's no way to stop it." I sat in silence. The tea went cold in my hands. "People aren't usually pulled in, at least not often," Callahan continued. "But sometimes, a soul trapped for too long will find a way to borrow a voice, to cry for help. Other times, it doesn't want help. It just wants to switch places." He looked at me for a long time, not in fear, but something closer to sorrow. "You're the second person I've seen speak of a voice from that room." I shivered. "Who was the first?" Callahan stood, retrieved an old file from a drawer. The label read, in fading ink, "Lorraine S. Klein." My blood ran cold. Lorraine Klein? Related to Matthew Klein? His mother. Callahan opened the file. Inside were trembling handwritten notes, smeared with red ink and crossed out lines. One passage read, "I heard it call to me, but it wasn't my Matthew. It used his voice, but the words were wrong. It screamed, then it laughed. I once believed my son was still alive, trapped somewhere, but no, he wasn't him anymore." I turned the page. A black and white photo slipped out. Blurry. Two figures. One was Matthew Klein, thin, wearing glasses. The other Lorraine. Somber brown hair. Eyes like stagnant water. They stood in front of Morgan Hall. I didn't know why the photo made me want to cry. Callahan whispered, "Lorraine died in 1997, set herself on fire, right at the sealed wall. Police never released the reason." That night I dreamed again. I stood once more before the sealed wall, but this time it wasn't Morgan Hall's hallway. I was inside a circular room, its walls lined with mirrors, yet none of them reflected me. They only repeated the same image. A door, slowly creaking open. Behind me, footsteps, slow, dragging. I didn't dare turn, but the voice whispered right at my ear, "I'm already inside, Eli. And now, you have to stay." I screamed and woke, standing in the hallway of the third floor, right outside, room 313. I had no idea how I'd gotten there. The door was ajar. Cold air poured out like from a bottomless cave, and I heard my own voice calling, "Eli, help me. Don't let it replace you." My heart pounded violently. I knew I was being pulled in. Each dream, each bruise, each whisper. It was all part of a ritual, a replacement, and I, or some version of me, was losing. I slammed the door shut and screamed for Sam. He came running up from downstairs, saw me, barehanded, knees scraped, nose bleeding. "Were you sleepwalking, Eli?" I shook my head, choking backwards. No, I wasn't sleepwalking. I was pulled. I saw what's inside, and it used my voice to ask for help. Sam hesitated, but then he gripped my shoulders tight. Then we end this, whatever it is, before you disappear like Matthew. We returned to Callahan. This time, he offered no warnings, no hesitation. He handed me a small aged wooden box. Inside, a black mirror, its silver backing nearly peeled away, leaving behind swirls like oil slicks. At its base, etched in Latin, Speculum Confinium, the mirror of the threshold. This mirror was once used to confirm the entity, Callahan explained. If a soul is still bound to physical space, it casts no reflection. But if it's already inside, the mirror reveals who's real and who isn't. I held it. It trembled faintly in my hands. Ice cold, heavy as stone. The final night. We returned to Morgan Hall. Sam kept watch. I stepped into room 313. One last time. The damaged wall now bore new cracks. From within came heavy, ragged breathing. Inhuman. I raised the mirror, facing the void. No reflection. Then I turned the mirror toward myself. And I froze. There was no reflection. Not of me. I screamed for Sam. He burst into the room, then stopped, staring in terror. Eli, you're not Eli. I tried to speak, tried to explain, but in the mirror, I saw it, another face, eyes with no whites, a mouth still moving, even as I said nothing. I don't know when it got in. Maybe in that dream. Maybe when I stood before Lorraine's photograph. But now it was too late. The shadow behind the wall was smiling, and I, or whatever now wore my face, had just called out to Sam. Come here. I need the next one. Story 7. The Uninvited. I never believed in the supernatural. I was a person of science, of logic, of things that could be measured. But everything began to change last autumn, when my husband, our 2 children and I, moved in with his family into an old wooden house on the edge of Ashford, North Carolina. It was a peaceful place, surrounded by fiery red maple trees and filled with strange old tales whispered over Friday night beers by the locals. My husband's family, the Blackwoods, had a strange tradition. Every year, on the death anniversary of any family member, they would hold a remembrance ritual. I used to think it was a touching gesture of respect until I witnessed the ceremony for great-grandmother Eleanor, who had supposedly died more than 80 years ago. There were no photos, no records, only a hand-drawn portrait hanging in the dark attic of an old woman's face. Eyeless, Caleb, my husband, told me it was part of the family's wishes. Eleanor died in a train accident in 1943. Her body was never found. Just a scorched red dress and her wedding ring. I still remember the look in my mother-in-law Dorothy's eyes when I asked if she had ever seen Eleanor in real life. You don't need to, she said. She's still here. The ritual was held on November 2nd, exactly at midnight. Light drizzle tapped at the windows, and wind through the pines behind the house made eerie moaning sounds. Caleb, Dorothy, his younger sister Emma, and even my 7-year-old daughter Ruby, dressed in black, and stepped into the living room. In the center sat a low wooden table draped with a white cloth. Upon it, a bowl of water, a re-rendered portrait of Eleanor, and a single burning red candle. I sat in the back, feeling misplaced in ritual I couldn't understand. They began chanting old Latin prayers, words I couldn't comprehend. But the moment that made my skin crawl was when the candle flickered wildly, then flared up, despite all the windows being shut. I told myself it was just coincidence, until Ruby started whispering to someone I couldn't see. She turned to me, her eyes wide, her voice eerily calm, like sleep talking. She said you shouldn't be here. You weren't invited. I froze. Who? Ruby? Who said that? She smiled faintly, then whispered, the woman with no eyes. 3 days after the ritual, everything started to go wrong. Knocking at the door just before dawn, with no one outside, the scent of burning wood creeping through the upstairs hallway at night. And most disturbing, muddy footprints appearing every morning in Ruby's room, though the floors had been clean and dry at bedtime. I tried to talk to Caleb, but he dismissed it. You're imagining things. We were just honoring her memory, nothing more. But the way his eyes darted when he said it, I knew he was hiding something. I decided to dig deeper into Eleanor Blackwood. But in the town archives, there was no record of anyone by that name dying in a train crash in 1943. No hospital files, no death certificate. Just a faded newspaper clipping about a train derailment north of town that year. 3 missing people. One of them, an unidentified woman. I asked Dorothy. She stiffened. No one outside the family should know about her. She was chosen, and we have to keep our promise. I pressed. What promise? She answered slowly. To never let her be alone. That night, I was awakened by slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. I thought it was Ruby, but when I opened the door, she was still asleep under her blanket. So who was walking? I followed the sound, heart pounding, inching toward the attic where Eleanor's portrait hung. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, someone stood facing away, wearing a singed red dress, long hair cascading down her back, and skin pale as paper. I stepped back trembling, but the door slammed shut before I could run. I screamed. Caleb came running. I told him someone was in the attic, but when he opened the door, it was empty. Just Eleanor's portrait, and something terrifying. The eyes in the painting were now wide open. The next morning, I decided to take Ruby and leave the house, but she cried and screamed, saying she couldn't go. If we leave, she'll be very angry. She said she'll take Dad, then you, then Emma, until no one forgets her again. I shivered. When had a remembrance ritual become a summoning? And then I realized something even more frightening. The woman they were honoring was never a part of this family. She was a discarded soul, nameless, buried nowhere, remembered by no one. And somehow, the Blackwood family borrowed her. They gave her a name, a role, a ceremony, and that gave her permission to exist, but a soul that has not moved on never stops. She wants more. She needs a body, and what she's doing now is slowly taking ours. I started to feel myself change. Not the kind of change you notice, like a haircut, a new outfit, or a different lifestyle. It was something quieter, something that seeped in like rainwater into rotting floorboards. A vague sense that I was no longer myself, but with no clear reason why. That morning, I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my teeth like always, when I caught a strange smile flash across the reflection. White, even teeth, but they weren't mine. I wasn't smiling. I was sure of it. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, told myself it was just an optical illusion. fatigue from too many sleepless nights. But when I opened my eyes again, I saw it. A thin hairline crack right in the center of my reflection's forehead. I'd never seen a crack in that mirror before, and what chilled me to the bone was the crack was only inside the reflection. When I reached out, the glass was still smooth to the touch, but in the mirror, the fracture seemed to grow, slowly, like roots crawling outward from the center of my mind. Caleb kept denying everything. He grew quieter, often waking up in the middle of the night, eyes wide open, sitting at the edge of the bed like he was hypnotized. One night, I asked him if he'd had a dream. He turned to me, his voice flat, like a puppet reciting a recording. "She doesn't want to be forgotten." I trembled. "Who is she, Caleb?" "Her name's been called. We can't take it back." I started keeping an eye on Ruby. She no longer drew rainbows or cute cats. The drawings taped to her walls now showed dark rooms, eyeless people, hands dragging bodies underground. In one picture, I saw a woman standing in the attic, her eyes two black holes, surrounded by members of my family, all hanging by ropes. I snatched the drawing and asked her who had taught her to draw like that. Ruby didn't look at me. She stared out the window and whispered, "She showed me. Don't you see her, Mom? She's standing right there." I turned to look. There was only the tree outside, swaying in the wind. I went to Emma, Caleb's younger sister. She lived in a wooden cabin deep in the woods, nearly a mile from the main house. She was the only one in the family who had ever truly left. Had lived in New York for a few years before returning suddenly. I asked her, "Do you believe Eleanor is really your great-grandmother?" Emma was silent for a long time. Then, in a soft, frightened voice, she said, "No, but once you know too much, you can't ever leave." I grabbed her hand. "What do you mean?" Emma looked at me, eyes red. "Every generation, someone's chosen to stay with her. First, it was Uncle Charles, Dorothy's brother. He disappeared in 1962. Then Caleb's dad. Then Uncle Luke. None of their bodies were ever found. You know what else? They held a memorial for Eleanor back then, just like this year. And afterward, one by one, they vanished from history. That night I heard murmuring coming from the basement. I thought it was Caleb, but when I went down, everything was dark and freezing. The lights didn't work. I turned on my phone flashlight. The beam swept across dusty shelves and cobwebs. The smell of mold, damp earth, and rusted iron mixed with something else. Blood. I was about to turn back when the light caught a crude drawing on the wall. A circle, surrounded by 8 names, 7 of them were crossed out. The 8th wasn't. I leaned in. The 8th name was Lisa. My name. Below it was a message, scratched into the plaster with what looked like fingernails. The right opens the door. You called. You will stay. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened, like something was gripping it shut. From behind me, in the darkness, I heard soft laughter. It echoed as if coming from inside my own skull. "Lisa, let me borrow your body. Just for a little while." I collapsed onto the basement floor, staring wide-eyed at the shadows dancing around me. A blurry figure emerged in the corner. A woman in a scorched red dress, hair tangled, her face barely visible, just 2 gaping black sockets bleeding dark. She came closer. I couldn't move. She leaned in, whispered, "You see me now. That means I can enter." I woke up the next morning in bed beside Caleb. No one knew I had been in the basement. No one heard me scream. But my palms were smeared with mud. and on my neck there were marks, like I'd been dragged. I ran to the bathroom, looked into the mirror. The crack had spread, webbing out like a spider's web, and in the reflection, I saw myself standing behind me. It wasn't me looking into the mirror. It was someone else with my exact face, looking out and smiling. I screamed, shattering the mirror. Glass flew everywhere, but in each shard, that same face stared back, each with a different smile, each with empty eyes. That night, Emma disappeared. The cabin in the woods was empty, no signs of a struggle, no evidence, just a black cloth spread out, candles burned down, and in the center of the table, a freshly placed portrait of Emma. I'm out of time. Eleanor, or whatever thing is wearing her name, is taking us one by one. And I know I'm next. I hadn't slept for 4 nights. Not because of the strange sounds in the walls, not because of the whispers echoing from the vents, but because I was afraid that if I closed my eyes, I would never open them again. I was afraid she would come the moment I was at my weakest, when my consciousness slipped into dreams. That was when she waited. Emma disappeared as if she had never existed. The police were called, but they only gave the old wooden house a cursory glance and asked a few questions. No signs of forced entry. No leads. No reason for suspicion. My mother-in-law, Dorothy, only said one thing. She was chosen, one in every generation. Her voice didn't shake. No tears, as if she had known all along. I asked Caleb, "Don't you think any of this is strange?" He looked at me like I was a stranger. "We should leave it alone. She's taken enough." "She? Who is she?" I snapped. Caleb lowered his head. "The one we prayed for." I screamed, grabbing his shirt. "That's not your ancestor. That's a thing. A fake. A creature." Caleb whispered like reciting a prayer. "But we called her name. And she answered. On the 5th night, I passed out from exhaustion. In my dream, I stood alone in the pine forest behind our house. The ground beneath my feet was soft, like raw flesh. The sky was moonless, starless. Yet the forest glowed, lit by the smoldering fire of red dresses hanging from the branches. Each dress burned brightly, spinning in midair like spirits dancing in flames. And then I saw them. The missing ones. Uncle Charles, Mr. Luke, Caleb's father, and now Emma. They all stood silently in the shadows, eyes blank, their skin gray and rotting. They spoke in unison. "Don't wake up, Lisa. It's your turn now." I tried to run, but something grabbed my legs. From cracks in the ground, hundreds of bony hands rose, gripping my ankles, pulling me down like they meant to bury me alive within the dream. I screamed until my throat burned, and then I opened my eyes. The room was pitch black. The clock read 2:03 a.m., but I wasn't in my bed. I was lying on the cold wooden floor of the attic. Above me, Eleanor's portrait hung on the wall, but the eyes were gone. 2 gaping holes, bleeding deep crimson, that trickled down the frame and soaked the floor where I lay. All around me, red candles burned, perfectly spaced, as if a ritual had already begun. In the air, the scent of ash, burnt flesh, and ancient perfume. Someone had brought me up here, or something. I crawled to my feet and stumbled down the stairs, slipping on every step. Caleb wasn't in the bedroom. I ran to Ruby's room, her door wide open, wind howling through the window. On the bed, only a cloth doll in a red dress. No eyes. I screamed her name. No answer. until I heard Ruby's voice calling from the basement. "I'm down here, Mommy." I raced down. The basement was pitch black, but her voice echoed as if she were right next to me. I turned on a flashlight, weaving past dusty shelves to the farthest corner. And then I saw it, an old wooden cradle, rotting and splintered. Inside was Ruby, sleeping deeply, like she was in a trance. Eyes shut tight, lips moving in silence. I shook her, screaming, "Ruby, wake up!" No reaction. Then another voice spoke from her mouth. A woman's voice. "You called me, and I came." I broke down, holding her tight. The voice continued. "Sleep is the easiest place to cross through. And now, I have entered." I carried Ruby out of the basement and began packing in a frenzy. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know who would believe me. But I knew one thing. If I hesitated, I'd lose her forever. Caleb appeared, blocking the doorway. "You can't take her? Move. She's been chosen. She needs a new body." I stepped back, trembling. Then I saw Caleb's eyes. One was pitch black, like burned charcoal. The other oozed dark blood. Caleb was no longer Caleb. He stepped forward, muttering, "Each generation, one child, each time a new soul. The blood must continue." I used all my strength to smash a lamp into his head. He collapsed, unconscious. I grabbed Ruby and fled into the storm. But when I turned the ignition, the car wouldn't start. The dashboard flickered a single time. 2:16 a.m. and behind me, I heard laughter. A woman's laughter, coming from the car radio, even though it wasn't on. "You think you can run, Lisa? You spoke my name. And names are forever." Ruby began to seize in my arms. I held her, sobbing, completely lost. And then she opened her eyes. But they weren't Ruby's soft brown eyes. They were two empty black pits. Her mouth curled into a smile, and she whispered in a raspy voice, "We'll sleep together, forever." I don't remember how long I screamed inside the car, engulfed in darkness, with my daughter laughing with a face that was no longer hers. Outside the window, the rain continued to fall, but there was no other sound, no wind, no frogs or insects. The whole world seemed suspended in a horrifying moment from which I couldn't escape. Everything stood still. Only my heart pounded like a war drum. And that voice, that hoarse, unfamiliar voice emanating from Ruby's mouth. "The body is a garment, sleep is the door. And you left it open for me to step through." Cambridge dictionaries translate, +1. I trembled, wrapping my arms around her, trying to call out, "Ruby, it's me, Mom. Don't leave me." But she didn't respond, her lifeless eyes fixed on the window, gazing toward the darkened pine forest. And then, a gaunt, pale hand with long, dark nails crossed the window from the outside. I screamed, recoiling, but that hand simply vanished, as if it had never existed. I decided I had to leave, immediately, by any means necessary. I restarted the car. This time, the engine roared to life, as if the vehicle knew it needed to escape. I sped away, tires screeching on the rain-soaked dirt road, leaving behind the house that was once my home, now merely a shrine for a counterfeit soul. I drove through the night to a small motel on the edge of the Appalachian forest. The innkeeper was a middle-aged woman named Marjorie. She didn't ask many questions, just looked at me with worried eyes when she saw Ruby asleep with her eyes wide open. I asked her for a secluded room, room 103, at the end of the hallway. The room was small, old, smelling of mildew, like so many places that had hosted too many people carrying sorrowful stories. But to me at that moment, It was the final refuge. I placed Ruby on the bed. She didn't move. Her heart still beat. Her breathing remained steady, but her consciousness was no longer there, as if her soul had been displaced by another. I sat beside her, sleepless, holding my phone, searching for any information about misguided soul summoning rituals. And then, in an old forum, I found a nearly hopeless comment among thousands of superstitious topics. If you summon the wrong spirit, it won't leave. It will use dreams, possess the body, and if not exorcised, it will fuse. And then, no one can reclaim the original body. I immediately called the commenter, a man named Jared in West Virginia, who had once practiced as an amateur exorcist. His voice was hoarse, weary, but when he heard me mention the name Eleanor, he fell silent for a long time. Then he said, "There are spirits that don't belong to any family line. They are the nameless ones, rejected, without name, without grave. When someone calls them by a name, that's the first time they exist, and they will do anything to hold onto the body, the memories, the life they never had. What must I do to save my child?" I nearly sobbed. "You must return that spirit to the place it was born, the place it was first named. Then sever the bond tying it to this world. But you only have one chance. If you fail, the child will never return." I had no other choice. I carried Ruby back to the Blackwood house the following night. The sky was red like coagulated blood. No moon, no wind. The house was eerily silent. Walls covered in moss, wood decayed, as if it had aged 100 years in the single night I had left. I went straight to the attic. The old altar was still there. But now, not only did it hold the portrait of Eleanor, but also one of Caleb, and beneath it, a new portrait of me. I nearly screamed. The room began to freeze, my breath visible in the air. Candles ignited on their own, and from the dark corner, the woman in the red dress stepped out. She was no longer a mere shadow. She had flesh, she had eyes, and I realized it was my face. I backed away, holding Ruby tightly. She whispered, "Thank you for giving me a name, for giving me form. Now we will be one." I screamed, "No!" I grabbed the necklace Caleb used to wear. Inside, it was the paper with the first prayer he had ever recited for Eleanor. I burned it before the altar, reciting the incantations backward, word by word, as Jared had instructed. Everything shook. The room seemed on the verge of collapse. Mirrors cracked. Walls groaned. She screamed, a sound piercing to the bone. Ruby began convulsing, eyes wide open, blood streaming from her nose. I nearly wanted to stop, but I couldn't. I recited the final words and plunged the old silver knife of Caleb's ancestors into the portrait of Eleanor. Blood spurted from the frame like a burst artery, and then everything ceased. She vanished. The wind calmed, the fire extinguished. Ruby moaned, then sat up. She looked at me with her familiar eyes. "Mom?" I held her tightly. Without a word, tears streaming down like a flood. We left Asheville the very next day, forever. The house was abandoned. No one dared approach. A year later, it burned to ashes in an unexplained fire. No traces were found, except a half-burned portrait in the rubble, with a blurred face. But the eyes remained, and they were wide open. Story 8. Parasite Beneath the Skin. I live alone in a modern apartment on the 17th floor of the West Shore View condominium, overlooking Lake Erie to the north of Cleveland, Ohio. The building is so quiet that sometimes I wonder if anyone else actually lives in the other units. The hallways are always chilly, and the elevators often carries a strong scent of bleach, as if something had been washed away there. I moved in 3 months ago after a draining breakup. I needed a fresh start. At least that's what I thought. Everything began with something very small. Literally, very small. One early December morning, I woke up with a tingling itch on my right hand. When I looked down, I had to squint for a few seconds. My pinky finger. It wasn't right. It was longer. Just a bit, but noticeable. The skin on the last joint was darker, as if the blood wasn't circulating well. And the nail, rough, ridged, like someone had been scratching a cement wall for too long. I jumped up, went into the bathroom and held my hand up to the mirror. Everything was the same, except for that finger. I tried moving it, and though it still moved with my hand, it felt like it didn't belong to me. A distinct sensation, as if I were controlling a glove with a misaligned finger. I reassured myself. Maybe it was just from sleeping in a bad position. I'd read somewhere about temporary nerve conditions after sleeping on a nerve. I visited a nearby clinic after work. The doctor was a middle-aged woman named Evelyn Rourke, gentle and meticulous. She examined my finger carefully, even had me get an X-ray. In the end, she just smiled and said, "I don't see anything unusual. Maybe you're just imagining things. Have you been stressed lately?" I just smiled and nodded. Who lives alone without stress? That night, I had a strange dream. I was standing in a long, dark hallway, with only a blinking red light at the end. There was some sound, like fingernails lightly scratching glass. I turned my head, trying to find the source of the sound, but only saw white walls stretching endlessly. When I looked down, my right pinky finger was detaching itself from my hand. It slithered away like a worm. I jolted awake, heart pounding. The nightlight was still on. The clock read 2:43 a.m. I lay still, my hand resting on my stomach, and the pinky finger was twitching. I wasn't moving, not flexing my hand, but I could clearly feel it was slowly bending each joint, as if someone was testing it. I jumped up panicked, rushed into the bathroom. My hand was ice cold, but that finger was strangely warm, as if it had its own pulse. I started paying attention. In the following nights, I used my phone to record my hand while I slept. I placed the camera on the bookshelf, aimed at the bed, to film all night. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. Around 2:20 a.m., in the dim glow of the nightlight, I saw my hand lying still on the blanket, except for the pinky. It was moving. Not an unconscious tremor, but deliberate movement. It bent, extended, then rotated slightly, as if practicing to do something. At times, it even lifted separately from the other fingers, as if waving to someone. I nearly dropped my phone when I fast-forwarded to 2:46. The pinky slid down to the edge of the bed, lightly scratching the sheet, then pointed towards the bedroom door. I began to lose sleep. Each night, I tried to bind my hand, tying that finger to my hand with cloth strips. But by the next morning, the ties were always undone. Not broken, untied by hand. I no longer dared to sleep alone. I called my best friend, Lana, who lived in Akron, and invited her over for the weekend. I didn't go into detail, Just said I felt strange and a bit scared. She agreed. That night, Lana slept on the sofa. I was in the bedroom. Around 3 a.m., I heard the sound of bare feet padding in the hallway. I opened the door, called out, "Lana!" No one answered, but when I turned to the right, the balcony door was open. The wind from Lake Erie blew in, making the curtains billow. Lana stood there, eyes closed, arms hanging limply, and her feet nearly dangling off the edge of the railing. I screamed, rushed to pull her back. She woke up immediately after, startled, and said she didn't remember anything. "I dreamed. You called me outside," Lana whispered. "You were standing on the balcony, but you had another hand." The next morning, Lana packed her things and apologized for not being able to stay. She didn't say much, but her eyes were clear. She was scared. I didn't blame her. If I could leave myself, I would too. That night, I didn't record video anymore. Instead, I set my phone to record audio, placing it right next to the bed. The next morning, when I played back the recording, I felt a chill down my spine. At first, there was only steady breathing, but around 2:39 a.m., there was a very faint whisper. "It's no longer yours." Then a soft laugh, right next to the microphone. The sound of a person, or something, very close to me. I couldn't explain these things to anyone. I couldn't afford a mental health professional. I had no family to rely on. I only had myself, and a finger that no longer belonged to me. I started keeping a journal about my right pinky finger. Sounds insane, I know, but I had no other way to stay calm. Every morning, I documented everything that finger had done, or what I thought it had done, during the night. I saved videos, audio recordings, and took photos of the strange, faint scratches on my hand. On some nights, I woke up with blood beading at the final joint. Not deep, but persistent, as if it was trying to carve itself a way out. I told no one about this. Lana hadn't called back. My family in Florida and I had never been close. And after I cut ties with Alex, the ex who cost me 3 years of therapy, I was completely isolated. That night, just as I had sworn, I let the finger lead. I didn't bind my hand, didn't record anything. No cameras, no audio. I lay still, eyes closed, but my mind was burning, alert like a fever. Around 3 a.m., I started feeling a subtle itch creeping along my right wrist, crawling up to my pinky. It curled in, then slowly stretched. My eyes were shut, but I knew it was moving. My finger slid down the side of the bed, inching like a tiny centipede, then tapped lightly on the wooden floor. One beat at a time. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. Suddenly I heard a response. From somewhere beneath the floor, or deeper than that, came a soft scratching, like fingernails against concrete. Scrape, scrape, then silence. I opened my eyes. Cold sweat soaked through the back of my shirt. The room was still dark, but I saw something standing in the corner. A figure, not moving, not breathing, just standing there. I didn't scream. I simply turned my face to the wall, pulled the blanket over my head, my heart pounding like a drum. I don't remember when I passed out, but when I woke up, it was gone, except for one thing. On the floor, right beside my right hand, there was a small scratch, like someone had etched an arrow with a fingernail. It pointed toward the front door. I took time off work. The reason I gave my boss was personal health issues. She didn't ask questions. I didn't need to lie much anyway. Something was taking over my body. A small part, but it was spreading. My ring finger had started to go numb. I decided to follow the arrow. I left my apartment at 3 a.m. the next morning, wearing a thick winter coat and stuffing my right hand into the pocket. I went barefoot. I didn't know why. I just knew I had to. The cold tiles in the hallway burned the soles of my feet, but the finger kept guiding. The elevator was out. I took the stairs. No one was on the ground floor. The glass doors slid open as I approached. The night air sliced through me like a blade. Lake Erie shimmered in the distance, ghostly and vast. I didn't drive. I walked, on instinct, guided by the twitching in my pocket, my finger brushing against my thigh like an urgent whisper. I don't know how long I walked, maybe over an hour, until I stopped in front of an abandoned building. Lakehurst Psychiatric Treatment Center. I'd never seen it before, but the name felt disturbingly familiar. I was sure I'd heard it somewhere. A crumbling 2-story building, broken glass, moss creeping up the walls, a rusted metal sign with faded letters. I stood at the gate, and my pinky twitched like it couldn't wait any longer. I stepped inside. Lakehurst was freezing, the mildew smell clinging to my skin. The flashlight on my phone barely lit the corridor. I followed the finger, step by step, like I was in a trance, through moss-covered hallways, through a flooded treatment room. I stopped before a wooden door, slightly ajar. My right hand lifted and pushed it open. Inside was an old room, maybe once a patient's. Faint pencil drawings still lingered on the walls. I shone my light, a hand, drawn in rough lines, 4 fingers, no pinky. A sharp pain stabbed through my right hand. I looked down and nearly passed out. My pinky was bleeding. No visible wound, but blood was seeping from beneath the nail, thick and black, like ink dripping onto the floor. I staggered back. The flashlight flickered and died. I reached out to the wall, trying to feel my way out. But as I turned, I heard the knocking again. Tap, tap, tap from inside the wall, the one with the drawing. I don't remember how I escaped. I only remember waking up in bed. The lights were on, my feet were caked with dirt, and the front door was still locked from the inside. But in my hand was a crumpled old piece of paper. I didn't know where it came from. Written in red ink, "You came looking, now it's our turn." Below it, a sketch. A human hand with 6 fingers. The 6th finger grew from where the pinky used to be. I didn't sleep that night. The paper with the red writing. "You sought us. Now it's our turn," still lay in the bedside drawer. I placed it there, as if locking it away could somehow keep me safe. But deep down, I knew nothing in this apartment, no lock, no light, could stop what was now inside my body. The pinky finger was no longer the only thing that felt off. I realized it the next morning while washing my face. The ring finger had grown longer. Not dramatically, but I knew my hand. Just like how hair can grow overnight. The slightest change is enough to chill you. Now, both outer fingers on my right hand had brittle nails, rimmed with a dark scorched black. I tried calling Dr. Evelyn Rourke, but the clinic said she had taken an indefinite leave. The nurse on the phone whispered, "After she met with you, she never came back." I hung up without replying. That entire day, I stayed home. No phone, no lights. I sat in a corner, wrapped in a blanket like a second skin. But the strangest thing happened around late afternoon. I heard a voice, not in my head, a real voice. Thin, wet, like someone drowning, choking on their own breath. "Open up. Let me out. It came from under the kitchen sink. I approached, trembling, and pulled back the wooden panel hiding the pipes, and for a split second, I saw something. White, like a human finger poking from the drain. Long, nailed, and filthy. I slammed the panel shut and shoved the refrigerator over it. That night, I dreamed of a hand crawling out from my throat. I woke up gasping, my throat burning, blood pouring from my nose onto the pillow. For the next 3 days, I didn't leave the house. I cut the internet, turned off every light, stuffed wet towels in door gaps to keep it out. But I was wrong. It wasn't outside anymore. It was in me. I started documenting the changes. Day 1, pinky moves on its own. Day 5, ring finger grows longer, becomes numb. Day 7, entire right hand lags behind brain signals, but moves independently with ease. Day 9, a fracture-like crack appears on my wrist, like a fault line in the earth. I sent images to an anonymous medical forum. Only one reply came from a user named Corvus Digitus 3. Stop, don't let it grow. If it forms the 6th finger, you won't be you anymore. I tried to respond. The account was deleted immediately after. On the 10th night, I discovered the 6th finger. It wasn't a full finger. Not yet. Just a raised patch of skin between my pinky and wrist. But under the flashlight, I could see it bulging, twitching, like something beneath the surface waiting to emerge. I vomited into the sink. Dark red strands laced the bile. My vision swam. I had to do something. I needed someone who had seen this before. I remembered the Lakehurst Psychiatric Center. I began digging through old archives and medical records. On a hospital record preservation site, I found a name, Dr. Malcolm Havers, former chief physician at Lakehurst before it was shut down in 1983 due to an unexplained incident. I traced him to a small town about 40 miles west of Cleveland. Lorraine. I didn't hesitate. Dr. Havers' house was a weathered wooden cabin at the edge of a forest, surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. I knocked in the rain, my right hand hidden in my coat pocket, where the 6th finger was beginning to grow a nail. He opened the door. An emaciated old man with silver hair, sunken eyes, and the cold stare of someone who had looked into hell. I didn't need to explain. I held up my hand. He understood. "You don't have much time," he murmured, voice shaking like dry leaves. He let me inside. The living room was stacked with medical books, yellowed newspapers, and black and white photographs of hands, each one missing a pinky. Dr. Havers recounted, in 1982, a patient named Ruth Granger was admitted to Lakehurst. She claimed to have a 6th finger, said it had been growing since childhood, though no one else could see it. Only she could feel it. Over time, the finger started controlling her movements. One night, she murdered 3 other patients, then gouged her own eyes out. Before dying, she said, "He has grown all his fingers. Now he lives." We didn't understand until I examined her pinky under a microscope. The cells, they weren't human. I sat in silence, clenching my hand until blood seeped from my palm. Dr. Havers looked at me, then whispered, "You have to cut it off before the 6th finger fully forms. If you don't, your soul will be replaced." I didn't respond, but in my head, a chilling thought echoed. Too late. Not my thought. Not my voice. It came from inside my right hand. Story 9. The Smile That Wasn't Mine. My name is Marissa Holloway. I'm 28 years old and live in Asheville, North Carolina. What I'm about to tell you isn't easy to put into words, because even now I still can't explain what really happened to me and my fiancée, Alex. It all started with what should have been something joyful: our wedding photos. We got engaged in March. After years of long-distance love due to work, Alex finally moved back from Chicago to Asheville. We wanted to mark the occasion with a vintage wedding photo shoot, shot on film instead of digital. Following a friend's recommendation, we went to a place called Greystone Studio, known for its retro photography style. It was a 2-story red brick building tucked away in an old alley off Lexington Street. The place looked abandoned, if not for the weathered wooden sign hanging above the door. Greystone Memories. We capture time. Inside, it was darker than I expected. The musty air, mixed with the scent of photochemicals, felt like stepping back into the 1960s. The walls were covered in black and white portraits. Brides standing beside grooms, all gazing off into the distance. And something about them felt deeply unsettling. Not all of them had visible faces. The photographer, Mr. Crowley, was a frail old man with parchment-like skin. He looked like someone plucked straight out of the past. High-collared shirt, worn tweed vest, and a pair of sunken eyes that didn't seem to blink. "You two want something classic, right?" he rasped. "We use an original Leica from 1954. We developed the film in our private darkroom downstairs. The prints will be ready right here." The session lasted about 3 hours. Natural light filtered through the stained glass windows, dusted with age, casting a dreamy, smoky glow. I wore a vintage white lace dress rented from the shop next door, also recommended by Mr. Crowley. Alex couldn't stop smiling. He said I looked like someone from a noir film. Everything seemed fine, until we got the photos 3 days later. A dark, leather-bound album was delivered straight to our house. I opened it, and it felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart. In every single photo, I had no face. Where my face should have been, there was only a blurry smudge, like the lens had fogged up or been scratched. In every photo with Alex beside me, my face was nothing but a cold, formless white blotch. I remembered clearly posing, smiling, standing next to him. But in the pictures, it was just him. An empty space. I called Mr. Crowley immediately. His voice, hoarse and brittle, sounded like he'd been expecting the call. "Sometimes, old film gets overexposed," he said calmly. "No need to worry, Miss Holloway. It happens." "No, you don't understand," I snapped. "Every single photo is like this." And I hesitated. I saw something in the blur. Yes, I had looked closely. I zoomed in on one photo where Alex stood behind me, arms wrapped around me, in front of a vintage mirror. But within the smudged space where I should have been, I saw another face. A woman. She stood exactly where I had stood, but she wasn't me. She wore a similar wedding dress, had long curly hair cascading over her shoulders, but her face was horrific. A crooked, wire-tightened smile and eyes, empty like a doll's hollow sockets. Shaking, I slammed the album shut. When I told Alex, he just laughed gently and said I was stressed from wedding planning. He didn't see the face in the blur, only the white smudge. But that night, when I woke up for a glass of water, I saw the photo album had been flipped closed, though I had left it open. The next day, I returned to Greystone Studio. The door was closed, but not locked. I nudged it open and called out, "Mr. Crowley, I need to ask you about our wedding photos." No response. The room felt deserted. I stepped inside, the creak of my shoes echoing on the worn wooden floor. A drawer on the work desk was slightly open. Inside were dozens of undeveloped photos in disarray. I pulled them out and froze when I saw one of me, standing alone against a pitch-black background, eyes staring straight at the lens. The problem was, I had never taken that photo. No Alex, no backdrop, just me, standing in what looked like an endless, ceilingless void. I gasped, nearly dropping the photo, when I heard a noise behind me. Clack, the door to the basement was slowly creaking open. No one emerged. Only a faint yellow light from an old filament bulb spilled onto the cement steps. I don't know why I walked down. Maybe it was rage, maybe curiosity. But as soon as my foot touched the last step, I knew I had made a mistake. The basement was an old dark room, filled with reels of film and dusty projectors. Dozens of bridal portraits hung on the wall, all blurred out or replaced with that same grotesque, twisted face I had seen. Some had no heads, some were turned backward, yet their dresses still faced the camera. In the center of the room stood a large cracked mirror, and in front of it, a vintage camera, still aimed directly at the glass. I stepped closer. The face staring back wasn't mine. I fled, clutching a single photo, the faceless bride I had found on the desk. Alex said I was obsessed, that I needed rest, that I had to stop thinking about it. But that night, he received an email from Greystone Studio. Just one line. She's chosen the right body. Attached was a photo. It was our wedding portrait. This time, clear and sharp. And the face in the white dress wasn't mine. But it smiled exactly like me. A crooked smile, with empty staring eyes. I don't know why I still keep that photo. Maybe because I need proof. Or maybe, deep down, I know it's not over. After the night I received that strange email from Studio Greystone, I couldn't sleep properly anymore. I locked the windows, pulled the thick curtains shut, unplugged the modem. But it didn't matter. Exactly at 3:33 a.m. each night, my phone alarm would activate on its own. Not the default tone, but a distorted sound, like an old cassette tape wheezing. At first, I thought I'd set it by accident. But by the fourth time, I realized it was the same track playing over and over. A short piano intro, cold and lifeless, followed by a warped laugh like metal scraping metal. I deleted the alarm, turned off the phone, but the sound still came the next night. Alex started changing. He barely spoke to me. He'd sit in front of the computer for hours, eyes locked on the screen. Sometimes, I'd walk in and see his editing software open, one of our wedding photos, but with an unfamiliar face merged in. Each time I asked, he would go silent, then shut the computer. One day, I decided to check the external hard drive he always used. I waited for him to go out for coffee, then quickly plugged it in. There was only one folder inside, named Wed Ghosts. I opened it. Inside were hundreds of wedding photos, but not ours. They were of other couples. Each album named after a bride: Rebecca, Amanda, Claire, Lorraine. And in every photo, the bride's face had been replaced by the same woman, the one with the crooked, slanted smile. My skin crawled. Some albums were labeled with years: 1973, 1982, 1995, even 1919. All bore the watermark Greystone Memories. I nearly threw up when I saw the album at the bottom. Marissa Holloway. But it didn't just contain wedding photos. It had childhood pictures of me, photos of me standing outside my elementary school, a picture of me and my mom when I was in third grade. I had never digitized those. No one could have had them, unless someone had taken them directly from my family's photo albums. Then, a video file started playing automatically in the corner of the screen. It was security footage from my apartment hallway, clear, night vision camera. I saw myself walking past, and standing just behind me was a blurry bride, a woman in the shadows, unmoving, tall, face hidden beneath her hair, and lace wedding dress dragging across the floor. When I turned around, no one was there, but she was still there, in the footage. I began investigating Greystone. No website, no Yelp page. I searched property records and found that the studio had been shut down in 1987 after a fire destroyed the basement. The former owner was a photographer named Milton Crowley, reported missing after the fire. The building had been abandoned ever since. No one had operated there for over 3 decades. So, who took our wedding photos? I called Julie, the friend who had supposedly recommended the studio. But she sounded confused. Swore she'd never heard of Greystone. Marissa, I don't know what you're talking about. Wherever you booked your shoot, ask them. But I'm sure I never gave you that name. I was speechless. I decided to go back to the building. This time, I brought a flashlight, a fully charged phone, and a small knife in my pocket. The front entrance was boarded shut, but I found a way in through the broken glass in the back door. It was colder inside than before. No electricity. The photos on the walls had rotted. Some had fallen to the floor. The air stank of smoke and mildew. I had to cover my nose. I followed the stairwell down to the basement. The dark room where I had once seen the large mirror was now empty. Only a scorched metal frame remained. But something on the wall caught my eye. A large portrait, dusty and tilted. I wiped it clean with my sleeve, and my heart almost stopped. It was me, but not me as I am now. It was me in a wedding dress, eyes vacant, head tilted slightly, smiling with that crooked, unnatural grin. My hand rested on the shoulder of a man, not Alex. It was Milton Crowley. At the bottom of the frame, hand carved into the wood, was a sentence. Received. Subject fully integrated. March 12, 2023. That was the date of our photo shoot. I stumbled backward, panic taking over. Then I heard a click behind me. A camera shutter. The shrill mechanical snap of an old Leica echoed through the dark. I spun around. No one, but on the floor was a fresh film negative. I picked it up, and in the flashlight beam, I saw clearly. It was me, bending down to pick up the film, with a shadow looming just behind me. No face, just a white smear, and a smile pulled too wide. I ran from the building, film in hand. I rushed to a local photo shop and asked them to develop it. The technician, an elderly man with silver hair, looked at the image and asked, trembling, Where did you find this? I didn't answer. He said, I used to work with Milton Crowley. He had a gift. He could capture spirit images, reflections not of this world. But he went mad after a shoot with a couple where the bride never came back. I choked. Never came back? She vanished the same night after the shoot. The family never found a body. But the strange thing was, in every single photo from that day, her face was gone. Just like what you've shown me. I went home, tried to delete every image, but the computer wouldn't allow it. The files kept duplicating. The file names were timestamps. O 33m's JPG. And in every photo I saw myself standing in a dark room holding a wedding bouquet. And the face wasn't mine anymore. Only the crooked smile remained. Ever since those photos began multiplying on my computer, like a silent infestation blooming from deep inside the hard drive, I no longer dared to open my laptop at night. I couldn't even stand in front of any mirror in the apartment. And then, I started seeing her even without mirrors. That week, I took unpaid leave from work. I told my company I needed time to prepare for the wedding. But in truth, I just curled up inside the apartment, avoiding light, avoiding even myself. The clinking of the radiator, the high heels clicking down the hallway, even the dripping from the sink, all of it made me flinch, as if someone was slowly creeping closer. Alex was hardly ever home. He said he was working late, but I knew he was avoiding me. Some nights, he'd come back after I was asleep. Some nights, I didn't sleep at all, and he never came back. I didn't suspect another woman. What scared me was the change in his eyes, like he no longer recognized who I was. One night, around 3 a.m., I heard clicking sounds from the storage room, the one I had sealed shut with black duct tape because of a broken hinge. But now, the sound returned. A light, steady tapping, like fingernails scratching the inside of the door. I grabbed a knife, trembling, and crept closer. And then I froze. On the surface of the door, faint smudges appeared, like handprints. 5 long, unnaturally stretched fingers, cold and damp, pressed from the inside. I was ready to flee the apartment for good. But then, a handwritten letter arrived. No return address, tucked under the doormat. The paper was yellowed, the ink a slanted, fading violet. If you still see your own face in the mirror, you still have time. But when you begin to see another, find the place where he took the first photograph. Only there can the thread be cut. At the bottom, a jagged signature, C.W. Harriman. I brought the letter to the old bookstore where I used to work in college and asked the owner, Mr. Neal, about the name. He went silent, then walked behind the counter and rummaged through the dusty shelves. Eventually, he pulled out a small brown leather-bound book, Portrait and Shadow, a history of magical photography studios in the Appalachians. I had never seen a book like it, nearly a chronicle of bizarre photography studios dating back to the early 20th century. One chapter stood out, Milton Crowley and the image that opened the gate. The story went like this. In 1919, Crowley, only 22 at the time, took a photograph said to contain the first known spirit reflection. A woman in a wedding dress stood with her back to the camera. But in the mirror behind her, another face appeared. Her name was Clarice W. Harriman, Crowley's fiancée. The photo was never published, but those who saw it claimed the face in the mirror wasn't Clarice. It was someone who had died long ago, a bride buried alive during a winter solstice ritual in the Blue Ridge Mountains. After that, Crowley was never the same. He believed he had accidentally opened a reflective channel, a gateway where faceless spirits could find bodies to return through. And according to the records, the first photo was taken inside an abandoned cabin on Blackthorn Hill, just north of Asheville. I decided to go, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. If there was any chance to cut the thread pulling me away from myself, it had to be at the beginning. I drove out near dusk, bringing a flashlight, a few candles, and the little book. Blackthorn Hill was desolate. No houses, only dry grass, cold stones, and ancient maple trees twisted like cracked arms clawing at the sky. The cabin leaned into the hillside, rotting, its roof bored and splintered, but it still stood, like a curse that refused to be forgotten. I pushed the door open. The air smelled of burnt wood, mildew, and settled ash. The main room had an old fireplace, a tattered rug, and a frame without a picture hanging on the wall. Dust coated everything, but beneath it, carved into the wood, I could make out faint letters. She saw herself and lost what was hers. I stepped back. The floor creaked beneath me. Then, a click echoed behind me. I turned. A vintage Leica camera stood in the middle of the room. No one had touched it. But the lens pointed directly at me, and through the viewfinder, I saw a face. Not mine, not hers. It was Clarice. I knew, because I had seen the sketch in the book. But she was no longer human. Her face looked as if it were melting, like her skin had been absorbed into the film itself. She opened her mouth. No sound. But I saw her lips move. Take my place. I ran. The sky had gone dark. I jumped into the car and looked at the rearview mirror. My face was gone. Only a grey void remained, as if light no longer touched my skin. I screamed, pushed the mirror aside, but every reflection, the car window, my phone screen, the shop front glass, all showed someone else standing where I was. There was no time left. When I got home, the phone rang. An unknown number. I answered. A woman's voice, faint, rasping, like breath through a torn throat. You stood where I once stood. You opened the door. You will be the next image. I no longer know what time is. Ever since the mirror stopped reflecting my face, everything has blurred like a reversed film reel, light leaking through cracks in my mind. I still live, breathe, eat like a human. But I'm no longer myself. Some mornings, I wake up in a wedding dress, even though I clearly went to bed in grey cotton pajamas. Some nights, I find strange dust under my bed, greyish-white, sticky, like ash from burnt film. I've started hearing camera shutters in the dark. I tried reaching out to the only person who might understand, Mr. Neil, the bookstore owner. I brought him C.W. Harriman's letter, along with the Portraits and Shadows book he once lent me. I didn't have to say much. When he saw me enter the shop, eyes sunken, hands clutching the journal so tightly my knuckles bled, he just nodded, as if he had expected this all along. You've seen the face, haven't you? He said, voice trembling. The one that doesn't belong to you. I nodded. Mr. Neil pulled down the window blinds and turned off the main lights. The whole room emmed under the desk lamp's warm glow. Then he brought out a small wooden box. Inside was an unprocessed roll of film. This is the last remaining copy of Clarice's photo. I found it in a warehouse in Boone that used to exhibit ghost photography before it shut down. No one dared develop it. I held the roll. It was ice cold, though we were in a sealed room. On the film's edge, there was an engraved sequence. 12:03, 1919, 03:33 a.m. A chill ran down my spine. That was the exact time I had received the first ghost photo from Greystone Studio, over a century apart, yet seemingly programmed. We need to break the cycle, Mr. Neil said. I once read that if the final roll is captured again, but this time by the cursed subject. The spectral image can't hold them anymore. I didn't understand it all, but I knew I was running out of time. We made a plan. That night, Mr. Neil and I returned to the cabin atop Blackthorn Hill, the place where the first photo was taken, where everything began. This time, I brought the old Leica camera I had stolen from Greystone's basement. Its lens had a fine crack, a black thread slicing through the glass, like a silent wound. I loaded the film. The house was eerily quiet. Wind hissed through rotting wooden slats. Moonlight, blocked by thick clouds, left only thin hairline beams shining through shattered windows. I stood before the empty photo frame. Mr. Neil held the light. I closed my eyes, raised the camera, and took the shot at exactly 03:33 a.m. Click. The shutter sound echoed like a door slamming shut. But at the same moment, I heard something else behind the house. The sound of a wedding dress sliding across wood. I turned. No one. But Mr. Neil backed away, pale as if drained of blood. No, that's not just a spectre. She's here. The door burst open. Out stepped Clarice, or what was left of her. She wore a tattered wedding gown, sewn together from lace that looked like flayed skin. Her face wouldn't stay still, as if it were endlessly decaying and regenerating. Her smile remained that same crooked grin, exactly like the photos, but her eyes were mine. I froze. You took my eyes? She approached without blinking, her hand extended as if inviting me to step into my own body, but the infected, rotting version. I used to be you, Clarice whispered. I had a face, a name, a wedding. But I was captured, and now I'm just reflection. Mr. Neil screamed and smashed the lamp into her. Light exploded like shattering glass, as if space itself cracked. Her scream wasn't human. It was layered with dozens, hundreds of voices, echoing from burning photographs on the walls. I yanked the film from the camera, rolling it by hand. My fingers bled, scraped raw by the metal edges. I handed it to Mr. Neil. Take it back, develop it, the old-fashioned way, no digital. What about you? I stepped back, gripping the Leica, pointing it at Clarice. I'll hold her off a little longer. Click. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up in a hospital, a psychiatric wing in Asheville. The police said they found me unconscious outside Mr. Neil's bookstore, clutching a scorched camera and a tightly wound film roll. Mr. Neil had vanished. His body was never found, but a week later, I received a developed photo from that final roll. It was me, standing before the cabin, holding the camera, eyes fierce, unafraid. And behind me, in the shadows, dozens of faceless brides, dissolving like ash. Since that day, no one has contacted me from Greystone again. The ghost photos vanished from my devices. My reflection came back, though it never quite feels real anymore. But there's one thing I'll never forget. Whenever it rains, I still hear a soft click from the corner of the room. And one time, when printing out an old family photo, I saw Clarice, hazy, standing behind me. Not sure if she was saying goodbye or waiting for the next time. Story 10, Reflections from Beyond the Grave. I moved into that house in mid-autumn when the yellow leaves rustled along the path and the air turned crisp like a vague warning of something about to happen. The house sat on the edge of Grey Moor, a tiny town nearly forgotten on the map of Oregon. It wasn't far from an old cemetery, separated only by a rotting wooden fence that bordered the backyard from the sunken, moss-covered graves. My name is Madison Hale, 27 years old, a freelance painter living alone after a rough breakup. City life had drained me, emotionally and financially. I needed a quiet place to paint and regain my balance, and this house, suspiciously cheap, seemed like the perfect choice. From the first moment I stepped inside, I felt something off. Not fear exactly, but a strange sense, as if the space still held someone's memories. There was a lingering musty scent, like old paper and damp earth, clinging to every corner of the rooms. The upstairs room drew me in the most. A small bedroom with a low ceiling and dim light filtering through the curtains. In it stood an old full-length mirror with an ornate carved wooden frame, looking like it had belonged to the house for generations. It was so heavy it couldn't be moved, as if it were a permanent fixture of the house itself. On my first night, I heard noises. Light footsteps moving quietly on the floor below, then the creak of a door opening and closing. But when I checked, everything was in place. Windows still locked. No one there but me. I began painting more. Inspiration pouring out after months of drought. But strangely, my recent paintings were all scenes of death. A girl standing in blood rain, a faceless man sitting by the bed, or a shadow staring through the bathroom door crack. I didn't remember thinking of these things. My hand just painted them, like it was being guided. 3 days after moving in, I met Thomas, the local mailman. A man in his 50s, friendly enough, but avoided looking directly at the house. When I asked about the previous occupants, he shrugged, dodged the question, and finally muttered, "You're the first one to stay longer than 3 days." That sentence kept echoing in my mind. That night, while brushing my teeth in the bathroom, I saw something in the mirror. Not my reflection. It was me, but different. Hair hanging limp, skin pale blue, and blood-filled eyes. I was standing in that same bathroom, clearly in the same position, but my face was marked with deep scratches. And the tears weren't tears. They were thick blood, trailing down my cheeks and staining the white nightgown. Behind me was a shadow, no clear shape, just a hazy black form, but I heard it laugh. A screeching laugh like metal dragged across glass, drawn out and then gone. When I turned around in panic, nothing was there, and the image in the mirror vanished as if it had never existed. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, fatigue, stress, but I couldn't sleep that night. At 2:43 a.m., there was a knock on the door. 3 heavy knocks, evenly spaced. I walked down the stairs, hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. But when I opened it, nothing but darkness and fog. However, at my feet lay an old yellowed piece of paper, scribbled in shaky handwriting. "Only the dead can see the future." I clutched the paper, panic flooding my chest. Someone was playing a sick game with me, or was I losing my mind? The next morning, I decided to remove the mirror from the room, but strangely, it wouldn't budge. I called in workers for help, but when they arrived, they looked around and said, "You said there's a standing mirror here, but there's nothing." I turned around. The mirror was still there, clear as day, big enough that you couldn't miss it. But to them, the room was just a bare wall. I didn't know how to explain it. But things got worse. I started dreaming. In the dream, I saw myself walking through the cemetery behind the house. I moved unconsciously, bare feet pressing on cold soil, until I stood before a nameless, headless grave. The tombstone only said, "Final image, drying blood." I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, like it would explode. When I checked the clock, the hands pointed exactly to 2:43, same time as the knocking the night before. I couldn't wait any longer. I began researching the house, and I discovered something terrifying. 10 years ago, a girl named Natalie Green lived here. She vanished without a trace. But neighbors said, before disappearing, she told her mother she had seen her own death unfolding in the mirror. No one believed her. And then Natalie vanished from the world. No body ever found. I started to panic. The image in the mirror, is that my future? And the worst question of all, have I already died if I can see it? Since that night, I haven't dared to look directly into the mirror. I covered it with an old sheet I found in the storage room, but I could still feel the strange presence behind the fabric. Something watching from the other side of the surface, waiting for me to weaken and turn my gaze back. 3 nights in a row, I had the same dream. I stood naked before the mirror, blood streaming from my eyes, my mouth agape, as though someone were choking me. In the reflection, I saw a distorted version of myself, hair tangled, face swollen, and a deep gash running from my ear to my chin. On the 4th morning, I decided to leave the house. Even if only for a few hours, I needed air, something that didn't smell of mold and invisible stairs. I went to the town library, a place rarely visited. There, I found a few old records about the area. In a local newspaper from 1981, I came across the name Natalie Green for the first time, next to a grainy black and white photograph of her, a girl with hollow eyes and tightly pressed lips, as if she were hiding something. In another article, one detail made my heart seize. Years prior, a woman named Agnes Marlowe, the former owner of the house, was found dead in her bathtub, blood seeping from her eyes, ears, and nose. The mirror in her room had been shattered, but the frame remained intact. No one could explain why police found a message scrawled in blood behind the broken glass. "It's coming from behind." I took a photo of the article and tracked down the journalist, a retired reporter named Walter Briggs. He lived about 20 minutes outside Greymore. I visited his home in the late afternoon, just as the wind began to whisper through the trees like endless moans. Walter was a frail old man with snow-white hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. When I showed him the newspaper and asked about the house, he didn't answer right away. He stood silent for a long moment, then suddenly pulled me inside and locked the door behind us. "You've seen the mirror, haven't you?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel in his throat. I didn't know how to respond. He didn't wait. "It doesn't reflect images. It reflects time. But not our time. The time on the other side, where there's no life or death, only what remains when the soul has left the body." A chill ran down my spine. "You need to leave that place. That mirror doesn't belong to this world. It was brought over from Europe after the war. The first owner, a man who claimed to speak to the dead, disappeared, leaving behind a mirror room covered in handprints from the inside. The house you're renting, that's the last place the mirror was kept before it vanished nearly 40 years ago." "Vanished?" I asked. Walter nodded. He pulled a rough map from a drawer, sketching out the area around my house. On the back, he wrote, "If you're still staying there, lock all the mirrors, even the smallest fragments. Don't let light from this side shine directly onto the surface. It'll awaken." I left his house at dusk, my chest heavy with a nameless fear. When I got home, I saw the front door slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it. Inside, the air reeked of something metallic and foul, like dried blood. In the bedroom, the sheet that had covered the mirror had fallen to the floor. The mirror was still there, unchanged. But no, something was off. This time, it didn't reflect anything. No me, no room, just a deep blackness, like the mouth of a pit. I turned and bolted for the stairs, but on the third step from the top, I froze. Bloody footprints. They began in the upstairs bathroom and descended one step at a time before vanishing halfway down the hallway below. I searched the house in a frenzy. No one was there, but I knew I was no longer alone. At midnight, I received a phone call from an unknown number. When I answered, there was no voice, but in the background, I heard soft whispering, a voice identical to mine, repeating the same phrase again and again. Dead, dead, dead. I threw the phone to the floor. Unable to take it any longer, I went online and searched for anything I could find about the mirror. After hours of digging, I found an old blog titled Dead Reflections, written by a woman named Catherine Blythe, who had once lived in the same house in 1995. Catherine wrote that she had seen her younger sister, who had died in a car crash, inside the mirror, standing in the corner of the room, pointing at her and saying, "Your turn is coming." Her final blog post was in March 1996, just days before she disappeared. The last line of the post read, "I see myself screaming in the mirror, but no one hears." I looked at the clock, 2:43 a.m. The knocking returned, 3 slow taps. Not at the door, but from behind the mirror. I don't remember how long I stood frozen after the knock. 3 knocks, from behind the mirror. Not the wind, not the old house groaning in bad weather. Real knocks, with force, with rhythm, with intent. I gripped the kitchen knife, the only thing I could grab in my panic, and climbed the stairs one slow step at a time, my legs drained of blood. I didn't dare turn on the lights. The darkness made things feel less real, or at least more bearable than the reality waiting for me upstairs. As I neared the bedroom, I heard breathing, faint, wheezing, wet. It didn't come from the room. It came from inside the mirror. I didn't look. I backed away, reaching for the sheet I had thrown over the glass. My hand trembled as I tried to cover the icy surface again. But before I could, I caught a glimpse, and I saw it. It wasn't me anymore. In the mirror was a room identical to mine, only darker. The chandelier overhead swayed, though there was no wind. And in the center of the room, something was standing. It had a human shape, but its body was blurred, like smoke. Its eyes were hollow, black bits, no light, no face. It didn't move. It just watched. When I pulled my hand away, the mirror returned to normal. I didn't sleep. I curled up in the living room until dawn, eyes locked on the mirror at the stairs, which reflected just enough of the door to the upstairs hall. Whenever I dozed off, I dreamed of Natalie Green. But this time, she wasn't standing still. She was running down an endless hallway, her hands dripping blood, screaming, "Stop looking! Stop looking into it." The next morning, I did what I should have done long ago. I searched for Natalie's mother. After several calls and some help from Walter Briggs, I found an address for Martha Green. She lived in the Evergreen Manor nursing home about 30 miles outside town. I called ahead, but the staff told me Martha rarely spoke. She'd withdrawn from everyone since 1992. I arrived that afternoon under a cloudy sky. Evergreen Manor was cold and eerily quiet, as if the place swallowed people's final memories before they vanished for good. Martha sat in a wheelchair, her eyes milky with age. But the moment I said Natalie's name, she jerked upright, faster than I ever thought possible for someone her age. "She's still in there, isn't she?" Her voice was cracked and raspy, like wind through broken glass. I nodded. Martha exhaled sharply, reached into her coat pocket with trembling fingers, and handed me something small. A broken shard of mirror wrapped in worn, faded cloth. Etched faintly on its surface was a spiral symbol. She whispered, "This is the last piece I kept. Natalie tried to break the mirror, but only a fragment came off. Most of it's still there. It's not easy to destroy. It doesn't belong to this world." I asked how Natalie knew. The mirror was the source of it all. One night, she called me, said she saw herself in the future, saw blood, saw death. She thought she was going insane. And then, she vanished. No body was ever found, but I knew she had been taken behind the mirror. Then a thought struck me. If Natalie was trapped behind, could I bring her back? Martha looked at me. Her eyes suddenly filled with something close to fear. "Don't. If you open that door, it won't let just one person through." That night, I brought the shard home. I placed it on the table next to a candle and the notebook where I'd recorded every detail for the past 2 weeks. I flipped through the pages until I stopped at a drawing I'd made, unconsciously, days ago. A dark room with a long crack running down the center of space. A crack that looked exactly like the frame of a mirror. I gathered my courage. For the first time since the first night, I stood in front of the mirror. I held the shard tightly in my hand, like a charm to ward off evil. I waited. Nothing happened, just my reflection. Tired eyes, hollow face. And then, the lights went out. I froze. Total darkness. But in the mirror, it was still lit. And I was still standing there. Only, it wasn't me. The other me smiled. A smile without warmth. Cold, sharp, unnatural. She raised her hand, gestured for me to come closer. I didn't want to, but my body moved forward on its own. The mirror began to crack. From the center, a web of fractures spread outward. A sound like bones breaking echoed in the air. And I swear I saw a hand from the other side push forward, pressing into the glass as if it was about to break through. I screamed and hurled the mirror shard at the center. A small burst erupted, not from the air, but inside my head. The room shook. I collapsed, my head hitting the bed frame. Darkness swallowed everything. When I woke up, I was still in my room. The mirror was intact, but this time, something had changed. The other side was empty. No more me. No more shadow. Nothing. I thought I was free. But when I washed my face in the bathroom, I saw red. A bruise. A purple handprint on my neck. Like someone had gripped me while I was unconscious. I'm not the only one looking into the mirror anymore. The question now is, what's looking back from the other side?